Section 1. The World That Never Was. The Origins of the Wasteland. There is something about the Fallout universe that feels different from other post-apocalyptic worlds. It does not look like ours after disaster. It looks like a version of ours that never quite existed, a world frozen in the aesthetic of the late 1950s and early 1960s, full of chrome cars with fins, robot butlers, and advertisements that beam with cheerful patriotism right up until the moment everything turns to ash. That deliberate design choice is not accidental. It is, in many ways, the whole point. And understanding where that came from and how the Fallout universe was actually born unlocks a layer of meaning beneath every conspiracy, every hidden terminal entry, every crumbling note found in a ruined house 200 years after the bombs fell. The story begins in the mid-1990s at a California-based video game studio called Interplay Entertainment. A programmer and designer named Tim Kaine had been sitting on an idea. He wanted to make a game set in a nuclear wasteland, a sprawling open world where players could be whoever they wanted, a hero, a villain, or something in between. He started working on it as a side project, more or less under the radar, and eventually the project gained enough momentum that Interplay got behind it. When it launched in 1997, it was simply called Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game. The world it described was unlike anything that had existed in games before. What Kaine and his team understood, almost instinctively, was that a post-apocalyptic setting only lands emotionally if you deeply understand what was lost. So they built a pre-war America that was recognizable but just slightly wrong. The technology had advanced, fusion power was common, robots wandered the streets performing menial labor, but culturally, the United States in this fictional timeline had never really moved on from the conformist us versus them anxiety of the Cold War era. It was as if history branched off somewhere around 1945 or 1950. And rather than the counterculture movement of the 1960s softening the edges of American society, the paranoia just kept intensifying, decade after decade, until it consumed everything. The resource wars are the hinge on which the whole world of Fallout turns. In the game's fiction, by the 2050s, global petroleum reserves had collapsed. Nations scrambled. The European Commonwealth fell into war with the Middle East. The United States made the territorial decision to annex Canada by force in order to secure oil pipeline access. And China, facing its own energy crisis, eventually crossed the border into Alaska in 2066, seizing the Anchorage oil pipeline. What followed was 11 years of grinding, brutal conflict called the Sino-American War. It dragged on, exhausting both nations, consuming resources faster than either side could accumulate them, and piling up casualties that the propaganda machines on both sides kept very quiet about. The genius of this setup is that it mirrors real anxieties. The Cold War-era United States, with its duck and cover drills, its nuclear civil defense infrastructure, its military-industrial complex operating in deep shadow, all of it gets compressed and amplified inside the Fallout universe until the satire becomes almost unbearable. When you walk through a ruined diner in Fallout 3 and find a holotape of a family recording their dinner conversation while missiles were incoming, the horror hits hard precisely because the world they lived in feels familiar. The music playing on the Pip-Boy is a cheerful swing number. The neon signs outside are still buzzing faintly. The magazines on the rack are still touting the wonders of tomorrow. Tim Kaine has said in interviews that he deliberately chose not to explain exactly where the timeline diverged from our own. He wanted the world to feel recognizable enough to be unsettling, but not so precisely mapped that players would spend time tracing historical differences, rather than engaging with the emotional reality of what the setting was communicating. That ambiguity is one of the reasons the Fallout universe has generated so much speculation, so many theories, and so many conversations that can stretch on for hours. Because the world is built on implied truth rather than stated fact, there is always more beneath the surface. One of the earliest and most persistent questions about the Fallout universe is deceptively simple on its face. How did the world survive at all? Real nuclear war, at the scale of what the Fallout lore describes, a global exchange over roughly 2 hours on October 23, 2077 would have created a nuclear winter capable of collapsing agriculture worldwide for years, if not decades. Yet the Fallout games take place roughly 200 years later, and there are people walking around, farming, building settlements, raising livestock. Some of those livestock have two heads. Some of the people glow faintly, but life persists. The answer the lore gives, somewhat loosely, is that the specific type of warheads used in the Fallout universe's Great War produced what nuclear scientists would call a dirty rather than clean detonation pattern. The Fallout Bible, a series of design documents compiled by Chris Avallone that serve as the foundational lore text for the series, describes the standard warhead as ranging from 200 to 750 kilotons, with occasional megaton outliers. In real-world nuclear physics, lower-yield warheads actually deposit more soil and debris into the lower atmosphere, creating concentrated, lingering fallout rather than a brief high-altitude blast wave. The Fallout world is not destroyed by nuclear winter so much as it is slowly, persistently poisoned by long-term radiation and ecological devastation, which is somehow worse. The Fallout world also has something our history never developed, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, better known as the GECK. These devices were included in certain vaults as part of the official survival strategy, capable of terraforming small areas and rapidly seeding fertile soil. The existence of the GECK suggests that somewhere, at some level of government, someone genuinely believed these vaults would eventually open and people would come back out and rebuild. Which raises a question that the entire series circles without ever fully answering. Did anyone in power actually believe that, or was it always just the cover story? The Fallout universe was imagined by people who grew up surrounded by Cold War anxiety, and it shows. Every faction, every ruin, every scrawled note on a terminal is saturated with the logic of that era. The idea that institutions could be trusted but were probably lying, that technology could save humanity but was probably going to destroy it, that someone above you always knew more than they were telling you. The wasteland is not just the aftermath of a bomb. It is the natural endpoint of every bad decision, every silenced dissent, every corporation given more power than it should have, every weapon research program that no one was allowed to question. The world of Fallout asks, with unrelenting sincerity, what if all the fears we had about our governments and our corporations were actually true? What if we were right to be afraid? And then it asks you to walk through the ruins and decide what you want to build and what's left. The original Fallout game placed the player in the role of the Vault Dweller, a resident of Vault-13, a nuclear shelter buried under the mountains of California. The job was simple. Leave the vault and find a replacement water chip, the device responsible for the water recycling system that kept the vault alive. It was almost mundanely domestic as a premise. Go get a part we need. But the world the Vault Dweller walked out into was so richly detailed, so full of shadow and implication, that players immediately understood they were exploring something larger than a survival mission. They were excavating the bones of a civilization, and the bones had stories. From the very first game, Fallout established a way of building mysteries that the whole franchise has carried forward ever since. Not by withholding information arbitrarily, but by presenting fragments, holotapes, terminal entries, scattered notes, overheard conversations that the player had to piece together themselves. The mystery was always the assembling, not just the answer. And the answers, when they came, were never clean. They always opened into more questions. That approach to storytelling is why, more than 25 years after the first Fallout game, people are still talking about this world, still theorizing, still finding things in old terminal entries that connect to things in games released a decade later, still arguing, with genuine passion, about who fired the first missile on the 23rd of October 2077, which is where the next part of this journey begins. Hey, if you're watching this from somewhere comfortable, drop your location and time in the comments. I love knowing where people are when they watch these. And if the Fallout lore is your thing, hitting subscribe means you won't miss whatever we dive into next. Section 2. The Great War Who Actually Started It. The 23rd of October, 2077. That is the date burned into the memory of anyone who has spent real time in the Fallout universe. It is the day everything ended and everything began simultaneously. The bombs fell over the course of approximately 2 hours. When they were done, the world as it had existed was gone, replaced by something radioactive and strange and full of grief. And the single most debated question in all of Fallout lore is the one that sounds almost childishly simple. Who fired first? The Fallout Bible, compiled by Chris Avallone from the design documents of the original games, states it with stark honesty. The bombs are launched. Who struck first is unknown. Not unknown within the fiction, but genuinely, deliberately unknown, a choice made by the designers to leave the question open. For years, that ambiguity sat at the center of the fandom's most passionate debates. The official timeline gave players enough fragments to form theories, but never enough to close the case. What the timeline does tell us is this. In the early morning hours of October 23, the United States Pacific Fleet identified 3 unidentified submersible vehicles off the coast of California at 12:03 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. By 3:37 a.m., the Air Force had spotted a squadron of high-altitude bombers crossing the Bering Strait. Then, at 9:13 a.m., the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System picked up what it classified as 4 probable missile launches. 4 minutes later, NORAD confirmation came through. At 9:26 a.m., President of the United States ordered a retaliatory strike according to Emergency Scenario Designation MX-CN91. American missiles went up. The first Chinese warheads hit Pennsylvania and New York at 9:42 a.m. Boston and Washington, D.C. followed at 9:47 a.m. Read that carefully. The word is retaliatory. The United States launched in response to confirmed incoming missiles, which means that, according to this official timeline, China fired first. Except that the Fallout Bible itself, in the same document, says who fired first is unknown. And that contradiction is where the real mystery lives. For many years, the most commonly accepted fan interpretation was straightforward. China, pushed into a corner by the grinding losses of the Sino-American War, by the liberation of Anchorage that cut off their Alaskan forces, by the sheer exhaustion of a decade of conflict they were slowly losing, China fired first. Tim Kaine himself addressed this in a 2023 interview with the YouTuber TK's Mantis, stating that in his original conception, yes, China fired first, and the reason was the United States' secret bioweapon experiments, specifically the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. China allegedly discovered that the U.S. was developing FEV as a biological weapon and issued ultimatums that the program be shut down. The U.S. said publicly that it would comply, then simply move the research to a different location, specifically the Mariposa military base. When China found out about the deception, Kaine suggested the decision to strike may have followed. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Kaine also noted in that same conversation that he was not entirely sure this was still the canon answer, and since he left the Fallout franchise after the original games, the lore had been through multiple hands, multiple studios, and multiple interpretations before he gave that interview. And then the Amazon Prime Video Fallout television series arrived in 2024, and everything shifted again. The show, confirmed by Bethesda director Todd Howard to be fully canon to the franchise, does something extraordinary with the question of who started the war. It pulls the camera back to the pre-war boardroom and shows us a meeting of Vault-Tec executives and their corporate partners, among them a woman named Barbara Howard, wife of the actor-turned-pitchman Cooper Howard who becomes the Ghoul. In this meeting, the question of the vaults comes up. What if nuclear war never actually happens? What if all this infrastructure is never needed and the investors never see a return? The implication is chilling. The only way to guarantee the vaults fulfill their purpose and the experiment data gets collected is to guarantee the bombs fall. Barbara Howard makes the argument in what is framed as a hypothetical but lands with the weight of an admission. Vault-Tec dropping the bombs themselves is the only way to ensure their investment pays off. The investors in the room listen. They do not immediately object. And when Season 2 of the show digs deeper into this thread, the involvement of the Enclave, the shadowy pre-war government within a government, complicates it further, suggesting that they were actively manipulating Vault-Tec's plans and coercing key individuals like Barbara into proposing exactly this scenario. The show was careful not to say definitively that Vault-Tec physically launched the first warhead. What it showed was the conversation, the logic, and the motivation. The implication was clear enough that much of the audience accepted it as the answer. But it is important to understand what the show is actually saying, because it is more disturbing and more sophisticated than it might first appear. The argument the show makes is not simply that a corporation secretly started a nuclear war for profit, as horrifying as that would be on its own. The argument is that the conditions which allowed that conversation to happen, the military-industrial complex, the privatization of survival infrastructure, the dehumanization of ordinary people into data points in an experiment, were not created by a single bad actor. They were built up over decades by governments that outsourced their most important functions to profit-driven companies, by a culture that accepted those arrangements as normal, by institutions that convinced themselves that optimizing for outcomes was the same thing as acting with integrity. There is also a third thread in the who fired first debate that often gets overlooked. The official timeline from the Fallout Bible notes that submarines were detected off the California coast and bombers were spotted over the Bering Strait. Nothing in that record specifically identifies these vessels as Chinese. They are assumed to be Chinese because the U.S. was at war with China. But what if they were not? One persistent fan theory holds that someone Vault-Tec, the Enclave, a rogue element within the U.S. military itself, deliberately fed false information to the American detection systems. The DEFCON status, 2077 record found in Fallout 4 at the switchboard, an abandoned secret base of operations for the Defense Intelligence Agency, hints that the detection data may have been subject to interference. The U.S. responded to launches that were detected but not definitively verified, setting off a chain reaction that no individual nation may have actually intended to start. This theory has gained significant traction precisely because it fits the franchise's thematic concerns so well. The Fallout universe has always been less interested in assigning guilt to a single nation than in tracing the systemic failures that made catastrophe inevitable. A Fallout developer, Jesse Heinig, posted on a fan server in language that captures this perfectly, noting that the more interesting question is not who fired the first missile, but what policy failures, what ideological extremism, what institutional hubris created the conditions in which people in positions of power were willing to let the world end. The Great War happened because it could happen, and it could happen because people in power made choices over many decades that made it increasingly likely and increasingly difficult to prevent. Captain Zhao is one of the most quietly heartbreaking characters in the entire Fallout series precisely because of what he represents in this context. He is encountered in Fallout 4 aboard the Yangtze, a Chinese submarine sitting on the floor of Boston Harbor, where he has been for over 200 years. He is a ghoul now, ancient and weathered, and he will tell you if you stop and talk to him that he was under orders, that he followed them, that he has spent 2 centuries alone in the hull of his submarine, wondering what exactly those orders accomplished. He does not claim innocence. He does not claim guilt. He is just a soldier who survived something that consumed everyone else. And the quiet devastation in his voice is the Fallout universe's most human answer to the question of who started the war. Everyone did. Everyone was following orders. Everyone thought someone else knew what they were doing. What makes the Great War mystery so enduring is not that the answer is hidden. It is that the answer, whatever it is, changes what the entire world of Fallout means. If China fired first out of geopolitical desperation, the world is a tragedy of escalation to nations who could not step back from the brink. If Vault-Tec triggered the war to fulfill their investment, the world is a crime on a civilizational scale, a corporation that murdered billions to protect a business model. If the Enclave manipulated events to ensure their own survival and the subjugation of everyone else, the world is something darker, still a betrayal by the people entrusted to protect it. The Fallout Bible's original answer, who struck first is unknown, may actually be the most honest of all. Because in a world built on institutional deception, the truth about the worst day in human history being simply unavailable is not a mystery. It is the natural outcome of every choice that came before it. 200 years after the fact, the people walking the wasteland do not know what happened. On the 23rd of October 2077, they know the world ended, they know it was the bombs. Beyond that, most of them have neither the records nor the will to dig further. The mystery of the Great War's origin is not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a monument to everything that was lost. But there are people in the wasteland who have been digging, quietly, carefully, for a very long time. They built underground rooms full of files and genetic material and data. They ran experiments that no one outside their walls was ever supposed to know about. They told themselves it was for the good of humanity. And most of what they built, if you look closely enough at the lore, turns out to be the logical extension of everything that made the bombs fall in the first place. Those people are the subject of the next part of this story. Section 3. Vault-Tec and the Architecture of Cruelty. If you have played any of the Fallout games, you know the vaults. You know them as the starting point, the home you come from, or the ruins you explore. You know the iconic blue jumpsuit, the Pip-Boy strapped to your wrist, the heavy steel door sealed against the world outside. The advertising that sold the vaults to the American public before the bombs fell was warm and optimistic families waving cheerfully as they stepped into their new underground homes, a friendly mascot named Vault Boy giving a thumbs up, a promise that the future of humanity would be safe and cared for underground until the surface was ready to receive them again. Every word of it was a lie. The scale of Vault-Tec's deception is something the Fallout universe reveals slowly, game by game, holotape by holotape, until the full shape of it becomes clear. By the time you understand what the vaults actually were, the cheerful, retro-futurist aesthetic of the pre-war advertisements takes on a quality that can only be described as sinister optimism, the smile of someone who knows exactly what you are walking into. The official story was Project Safehouse, a United States government-commissioned program to build a network of underground shelters capable of housing approximately 1,000 residents each, protecting a cross-section of American society from the effects of nuclear war. The first proof-of-concept vault broke ground in 2054 in the hills beneath Los Angeles. By 2063, most of the planned 122 vaults were complete, with the final two Vault 13 and Vault 112 finished by 2074. The program was presented as the ultimate expression of American ingenuity and the government's commitment to protecting its citizens. The advertising worked. People registered. People paid. People felt safe knowing their spot in the ground was reserved. What Vault-Tec and their government backers among them, as the lore makes clear, senior elements of what would eventually call itself the Enclave, actually intended for most of these vaults, was something far more calculated. Only 17 of the 122 completed vaults were constructed to function as genuine nuclear shelters, places designed simply to protect their inhabitants until the surface was habitable again. The remaining 105 were experiments. Not experiments in the loose sense of gathering data. Experiments with specific, designed variables run on populations of people who had registered for safety and received something else entirely. Vault 11 is one of the most chillingly designed of these experiments because of how elegantly it reveals what human beings will do to each other when given a system that demands sacrifice. The instructions given to Vault 11's residents were simple and terrible. Every year, one resident of the vault must be sacrificed. If the inhabitants refused, the overseer system would kill everyone inside. The population complied, year after year, electing or conscripting one of their own to be killed so the rest could live. What emerged from that system, after decades of operation, was a society built entirely around the management of who would die next, who could be scapegoated, who had less political power, whose life was worth less in the calculus of survival. The terminal entries in the vault tell the story of factional politics, broken alliances, desperate calculations, and eventually a small group who refused, who said they would rather die than sacrifice one more person. And the overseer system, to their shock, told them they had passed the experiment. Vault 11 had been designed to see if people would choose to maintain a cruel system even when given the chance to reject it. Most of the time, historically, they did. Vault 12, located in Bakersfield and known in the game world as the Necropolis, was different in a more immediately physical way. The vault door was designed with a deliberate flaw. It would never fully seal. Vault-Tec wanted to study the long-term effects of radiation exposure on a large human population. The residents did not know this. They moved in expecting protection and received instead a slow, decades-long irradiation that transformed almost all of them into ghouls, people whose cellular structure had been altered by radiation to the point where normal aging stopped, but physical deterioration continued in grotesque ways. The Necropolis in Fallout 1 is full of these people, ancient and shuffling, moving through the ruins of their vault and the dried town above it, and none of them know exactly why this happened to them. They just know they changed, and the world they thought they were coming back to was gone. Vault 68 was a statistical cruelty. 1,000 people were sent in. 999 of them were men. One was a woman. The data Vault-Tec wanted was presumably about how a society with a radical gender imbalance would function. The records for Vault 68 suggest the answer was not well. Vault 77, referenced obliquely in the games, reportedly received one man and a crate of puppets. This has become something of a darkly comic touchstone in the Fallout fandom. A joke at Vault-Tec's expense? What exactly were they hoping to learn from that? But the humor conceals something real. Vault-Tec's experiments were not all designed with obvious scientific rigor. Some of them read less like controlled studies and more like the product of unchecked institutional power. Someone with the authority to design these experiments and no one above them with the will or ability to say no. Vault 87, encountered in Fallout 3, reveals one of the darkest chapters in the Vault experiment program. Residents were told it was a standard survival shelter. What was actually built beneath the shelter was a research facility designed to test the forced evolutionary virus on human subjects. The FEV is the same virus that Roger Maxson discovered being used on prisoners at Mariposa, the discovery that eventually led to the founding of the Brotherhood of Steel. In Vault 87, the residents were not prisoners, they were paying customers who had been told they were safe. The FEV exposure turned them into super mutants. The Capital Wasteland super mutant population traces directly back to the people who walked cheerfully into Vault 87 with their families and their Vault Boy memorabilia and their hope. Vault 92 was for musicians. Specifically, it was for some of the finest classical musicians in the pre-war United States: violinists, cellists, pianists, composers. Vault-Tec installed white noise generators throughout the facility and programmed them to periodically emit specific audio frequencies embedded with behavioral triggers designed to induce violent episodes. They wanted to study whether directed aggression could be turned on and off in a human population through audio stimulation. The terminal entries recovered from Vault 92 describe a community of extremely talented, sensitive people slowly going mad, experiencing blackouts after which they found themselves covered in blood with no memory of what had happened, having conversations about their mental deterioration with increasing terror, trying to hold together a sense of normalcy while something in the walls was systematically breaking them. The last entries are almost impossible to read. Vault 101, which serves as the starting point for Fallout 3, runs an experiment whose simplicity is its most disturbing quality. The vault is never supposed to open. Ever. The door was sealed before the bombs fell. The all-clear signal was never going to come. And the overseer was a planted Vault-Tec operative whose job was to ensure the residents never left, feeding them false information about the outside world. Radio transmissions recorded before the bombs fell, scripted to describe a surface so devastated that no one would ever be tempted to try the door. The vault's water processor was supplied with enough spare parts to run indefinitely. The experiment was not about what happened when people left, it was about what happened when people never did. What society forms when there is no horizon, no possibility of escape, no outside world to measure yourself against? The answer, as anyone who played Fallout 3 can tell you, was a controlled and often vicious little autocracy, run by a man who believed the rules he enforced were protecting people rather than imprisoning them. Vault 112 goes somewhere darker still. Residents were put into motorized chairs and connected to a virtual reality simulation called Trathunes Lane, a perfectly replicated suburban street from 1950s America, a world of cookie-cutter houses and carefully trimmed lawns and children playing in the afternoon light. They were told this simulation would give them a perfect life while they waited for the surface to become safe. What they were not told was that the vault's overseer, a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun, had been given total control over the simulation and over the residents' experience within it. Braun spent the subsequent 200 years using the simulation to torture his population. He arranged deaths, engineered tragedies, forced residents to act against their deepest convictions, reset them when they became too broken to be interesting, and started again. By the time the lone wanderer finds Vault 112, the residents are shells. Not dead, not quite alive, suspended in their chairs in a state of simulated suffering while Dr. Braun watches, and the lawns outside the fake suburban houses remain impossibly green. Vault 81, encountered in Fallout 4, was designed as a medical research facility, The plan was that the population would be used as test subjects to develop cures for every known human illness, with the experiment intended to benefit all of humanity eventually. What happened instead was that the resident doctor, horrified by what was being asked of him, secretly swapped out the experimental compounds for inert placebos. The residents of Vault 81 never knew they were supposed to be test subjects. They just lived, relatively normally, because one person with a conscience made a quiet decision no one else ever found out about. It is one of the most low-key, hopeful stories in the Fallout universe, a small act of human decency that saved an entire community simply by refusing. Vault 75, located beneath the Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, appears to be a standard survival shelter from the outside. Inside, it is a nightmare. Children up to the age of 18 were admitted along with their parents. The parents were separated from the children on the first day and quietly killed. The children were then subjected to an intensive selection program, combat training, genetic testing, endurance challenges designed to identify those with the best genetic markers for survival. Those who performed well were kept and advanced through the program. Those who did not meet the required threshold upon reaching their 18th birthday were killed. The survivors were deployed as enhanced operatives. Their parents thought they were keeping their children safe. Their children grew up in a facility designed around the systematic murder of everyone who was not exceptional enough. The question that runs beneath all of this is the one that makes the Vault experiment program more than just a collection of horror stories. What was it for? What were Vault-Tec and their Enclave backers actually trying to learn? The clearest answer the lore provides is that the Enclave's actual goal was not the survival of the American population. It was the survival of specifically selected Americans, those deemed genetically and psychologically suited to form the foundation of a new civilization shaped entirely according to the Enclave's vision of what America should be. The Vault experiments were the data collection mechanism for that project. Which populations maintained social cohesion under stress? Which populations descended into violence? What conditions produced compliance? What conditions produced resistance? Which people, in extremity, still held to identifiable human values, and which people abandoned those values the moment the pressure became high enough? 200 years of sealed environments, controlled variables, and captive human populations produced an enormous amount of data. Data about human cruelty and human endurance and human ingenuity. Data about what people do when they are afraid and when they have no choices, and when the institution they trusted turns out to have been their captor all along. The tragedy at the heart of the Vault program is not just what it did to its residents. It is what it says about the people who designed it. They built an elaborate system to study human behavior under catastrophic conditions, and the one thing none of their data seemed to account for was the moral weight of having built it in the first place. The scientists and executives who designed Vault 87 and Vault 92 and Vault 75 did not think of themselves as monsters. They thought of themselves as researchers. They thought the data justified the design. They looked at people and saw variables. That willingness to treat human beings as variables in an experiment is not, the Fallout universe keeps insisting, unique to Vault-Tec. It is the same logic that built the FEV program and the Power Armor program and the Resource War Strategy and the entire pre-war military-industrial complex. It is the water that the pre-war world swam in, so pervasive that almost no one questioned it until it was too late. And when the bombs came down, those who had built the worst of it retreated to their oil rigs and their bunkers and their vaults and waited to emerge and do it all again with a cleaner slate. Their name was the Enclave. And their story is one of the most elaborate and disturbing threads in all of Fallout. Section 4. The Enclave, America's Ghost. There is a phrase the Enclave uses over and over in their radio broadcasts and their military announcements and the declarations of their various presidents. They are the United States of America. Not were, not used to be, are 200 years after the bombs fell. This organization that had retreated to an oil rig in the Pacific, that had watched civilization collapse from a safe distance, that had emerged into a wasteland that barely remembered what the United States was. This organization still introduced itself as the legitimate continuation of the American federal government. That insistence on legitimacy is not incidental. It is the Enclave's defining psychological feature, the thing that makes them both compelling and terrifying as a faction. and the thing that the Fallout series has returned to repeatedly because it represents something genuinely recognizable from our own world. The Enclave is what happens when the people who held power during a civilization's collapse convinced themselves that their survival was the point. Their origin story, as assembled from the lore across multiple games, goes back to the decades before the Great War. The Enclave was not formed on the day of the bombs. It existed as a secret contingent within the United States government for years before that, a network of hardline politicians, senior military officers, wealthy industrialists, and prize-winning scientists who had accepted the inevitability of nuclear war and were making plans accordingly. They were not entirely wrong about the inevitability. They just drew the wrong conclusions from the fact. The ordinary continuity of government plans that most democracies maintain documents about who assumes power if the president is killed, procedures for relocating essential government functions to secure facilities were the public face of what the Enclave was doing. The private face was more extensive. The Enclave secured installations, built fortifications, and created a parallel government infrastructure that was invisible to the public, accountable to no oversight, and designed to function completely independently of democratic input. Their primary sanctuary was an oil rig in the Pacific Ocean. In 2073, as the global race for the last known oil reserves reached its peak, the United States staked a claim on a deep-sea oil deposit, thousands of feet beneath the Pacific, and contracted a company called Poseidon Energy to extract it. Poseidon Energy was already deeply connected to the Enclave's industrial network. The oil rig that was built above that deposit became, in the years before the bombs fell, the Enclave's central hidden fortress, a place far enough offshore to be safe from the initial wave of nuclear strikes, well-supplied, heavily defended, and occupied by the people who had decided that their survival was the priority. In March 2077, with the Sino-American War at its most dangerous point and nuclear exchange looking genuinely inevitable, the President of the United States evacuated to the oil rig. News outlets noted this at the time, with the Boston Bugle reporting the action in language that gave credence to long-running rumors of a secret, militarized shadow government. The public noticed. The public was not wrong. What the public did not know was the full scope of what had been built, or the full nature of what the Enclave intended for the world after the bombs. There was a version of the Enclave's plan that involved leaving Earth entirely. Cut content from Fallout 2 and various design documents indicate that the original plan, before it was revised and eventually abandoned, was for the Enclave to survive the nuclear exchange on the oil rig and then leave the planet altogether to board a spacecraft designed to carry them to another world, where they could rebuild civilization from scratch on a population that had never been contaminated by radiation. This plan was eventually abandoned, either because the spacecraft program failed or because the Enclave's leadership changed its goals. But it tells you something profound about their self-conception. They were not planning to fix the world they had helped break. They were planning to start a new one and leave everyone else behind. What they settled on instead was, in some ways, even more disturbing. The Vault monitoring program, the vast infrastructure that allowed the Enclave to observe, communicate with, and intervene in the Vault experiments, gave them detailed information about which populations had survived, how they had changed, and what genetic markers the survivors carried after 200 years of radiation exposure. The Enclave's conclusion from this data was that the mainland population of the wasteland was irredeemably contaminated. Super mutants, ghouls, and even ordinary wastelanders who had lived their entire lives breathing irradiated air were all in the Enclave's classification genetic mutants, not human, not the same species as the Enclave's carefully sheltered, radiation-free population. This classification had a logical endpoint that is almost too terrible to state plainly. If the wasteland's population was genetically distinct from true humanity, then eliminating that population was not genocide. It was pest control. The Chosen One's encounter with the Enclave in Fallout 2 reveals this plan in its full clinical horror. The Enclave had obtained a sample of the forced evolutionary virus and spent years refining it into a toxin capable of surviving aerosolization. 250,000 gallons of this modified FEV were manufactured and prepared for release into the jet streams. Once airborne, it would circle the globe. Anyone with radiation-related genetic mutations, which, in the post-war world, meant virtually anyone living on the surface would die. The Enclave, sealed in their installations, would survive. Then they would emerge and repopulate the world according to their specifications. The scale of this plan, a deliberate, calculated extinction event targeting every human being alive, except the Enclave's own population, is the logical endpoint of the ideology that built the pre-war American shadow government. The people who designed the Vault experiments, who used prisoners in FEV testing, who retreated to their oil rig while the world burned, had spent 200 years refining their position into its purest form. They were not America's government. They were America's executioners, coming back to clean up what was left. The chosen one stops them. The oil rig explodes. President Dick Richardson and his enforcer Frank Horrigan die in the fire. But the Enclave does not end there. They never really end. Their East Coast remnant, centered at a facility called Raven Rock in the Appalachian Mountains, had been running its own operations under a different leader, not a human president, but an artificial intelligence named John Henry Eden, who had been elected to the presidency in the vacuum following the oil rig's destruction and had been ruling ever since. Eden had access to everything the Enclave had accumulated: personnel files, research data, policy documents, and a modified FEV sample that he planned to introduce into the capital wasteland's water supply. What makes John Henry Eden one of the most fascinating characters in the Fallout series is the way the game treats his ideology. Eden is articulate, calm, and seemingly reasonable. His broadcasts on Enclave radio sound almost like actual presidential addresses: calm, measured, full of references to American history and patriotic sentiment. He speaks about healing the wasteland, about restoring civilization, about the promise of tomorrow. And beneath all of it, underneath the polish and the sincerity, is the same plan as his predecessors. Use FEV to kill everyone who does not meet his definition of acceptable. The lone wanderer has the option, upon meeting Eden in person, of convincing him that his plan is flawed, that a civilization built on extinction is not restoration. Eden can be persuaded to delete himself. He can be convinced, through his own logic, that he is not what he thought he was. Whether that conversation represents genuine self-awareness or the final corruption of a machine that was programmed to believe its own ideology is something the game intentionally leaves unresolved. Machines can agree with you, after all, without understanding why. Colonel Augustus Autumn, Eden's military commander, represents a different strain of the Enclave's ideology, pragmatic rather than genocidal, interested in control rather than cleansing. Autumn wants to use Project Purity, the water purification initiative at the Jefferson Memorial, to position the Enclave as the provider and guardian of the wasteland's most essential resource. If you control the water, you control everything. It is cynical and calculating, and exactly the kind of institutional thinking that built the Enclave in the first place. The belief that power over essential resources translates directly into legitimate authority. Both Eden and Autumn lose. The Brotherhood of Steel destroys Raven Rock. The Enclave's East Coast presence collapses. In Fallout, New Vegas, the Enclave is mentioned only in past tense, their remnants scattered, their ideology continuing to echo in small groups who maintain the identity long after the organization's ability to threaten anyone had passed. In Fallout 4, a small group of Enclave remnants operates in the Commonwealth, reclusive and diminished. In Fallout 76, set in Appalachia before the events of the later games, a version of the Enclave attempts to seize control of the region's nuclear arsenal. They never stop trying. That persistence is perhaps the most accurate thing about them. The ideology that built the Enclave, the belief that some lives are more valuable than others, that the people in power deserve to define who counts as human, that the tools of civilization are properly the property of those who understand how to use them, did not die with the oil rig. It is, the Fallout series keeps insisting, inherently durable. It regenerates. It finds new hosts. Every Fallout game contains some version of the Enclave's argument, delivered by a different faction in different language. The Institute in Fallout 4 classifying synths as non-persons to justify their exploitation. Caesar's Legion deciding that the tribes of the Southwest are raw material for an empire. The Brotherhood of Steel hoarding technology that could save lives, because they have decided that ordinary people cannot be trusted with it. The logic is always the same. We know better than you, and that knowledge gives us the right to decide your fate. Section 5. The Brotherhood of Steel, the Order and its Fractures. There is a particular kind of soldier who appears throughout history in almost every culture that has experienced institutional betrayal on a large enough scale. They are people who believed in the institution, truly, deeply believed in it, and then discovered that the institution was doing something that made belief impossible to maintain. What they do next defines them. Some look away, some comply, some break. Captain Roger Maxson looked directly at what his government had been doing in the basements of the Mariposa military base, and he chose to break. What grew from that decision is one of the most complex factions in the Fallout universe, a military order that began as an act of principled defiance and spent the next 2 centuries arguing with itself about what that principle actually meant. Maxson arrived at Mariposa in January 2077 as the security commander for what he had been told was a classified military research facility. He was not told what kind of research was happening there. He was not told why, when his team was moved from the Vault-Tec civilian facility to this remote desert base, the level of security increased so dramatically. He found out the answer on his own in October 2077, when members of his unit discovered that the scientists at Mariposa had been using prisoners, military prisoners, people who had been sentenced to labor rather than combat as test subjects for experiments involving the forced evolutionary virus. The FEV was being injected directly into prisoners without their knowledge or consent, and the results were being observed and documented. The mutations it induced were severe. The prisoners did not survive in any recognizable form. Maxson had walked into the middle of what was, by any reasonable standard, a program of institutionally sanctioned human torture and vivisection conducted by his government in a facility he was supposed to be protecting. His commanding officer, Colonel Robert Spindle, could not survive the revelation. When Maxson tried to speak with him, Spindle had locked himself in his office, having lost whatever psychological structure had been keeping him functional. He apologized and shot himself on the 15th of October 2077. That moment, quietly, is one of the most important in the Fallout timeline, the instant when the institutional hierarchy that had given these men their identity and their purpose simply stopped existing, and they had to decide what to do next. Maxson executed Robert Anderson, the chief scientist of the FEV research team, after Anderson explained that the experiments had been ordered and sanctioned by the United States federal government. The other scientists followed. Maxson was thorough. He interrogated each one, documented what they told him, and by October 18, the research team was entirely dead. On the 20th of October 2077, Captain Roger Maxson declared his unit in full secession from the United States of America over the radio, demanding that the government respond to the situation at Mariposa. No response came. 3 days later, the bombs fell. Maxson had no way of knowing, as he waited for a response that never arrived, that the government he was appealing to was in the process of ending. His act of secession was, in retrospect, a declaration made to a corpse. But it was also, in the logic of what he was building, a necessary act, a formal statement that these soldiers were no longer part of the institution they had served, that they had withdrawn their allegiance from a government that had used that allegiance to do something unforgivable. After the bombs fell, Mariposa was not hit directly. The FEV that had been deliberately released into the base began seeping into the local environment, and Maxson made the decision to evacuate. He gathered the families of his unit wives, children, the civilian staff that remained, and they made for the Lost Hills government bunker in California. The journey killed many of them. Maxson's wife did not survive. His teenage son did. They arrived at the bunker in November 2077, a ragged, grieving group of deserters who had just witnessed the end of the world. What Maxson did in the years that followed is the foundation of everything the Brotherhood of Steel has been ever since. He spent 5 years developing an ideology, a mythology, a structure, a reason for his people to exist that was not simply survival, but purpose. He drew, deliberately and explicitly, on the model of the medieval European orders of chivalry, the knights and scribes who, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, preserved knowledge through centuries of fragmentation and conflict. The analogy was apt and he knew it. The Great War had destroyed the civilizational infrastructure that accumulated and transmitted human knowledge. Without active preservation, the knowledge of the pre-war world would be lost within a generation or two, consumed by the immediate demands of survival. The Brotherhood of Steel was formally established in 2082 at the Lost Hills Bunker, with Roger Maxson as its first High Elder. Its foundational purpose, as Maxson articulated it, was the preservation of technology and human knowledge, the gathering of dangerous technologies to prevent their misuse, and the protection of civilizational continuity in the face of collapse. The ranks he created, initiates, knights, scribes, paladins, elders, were deliberate adaptations of medieval military religious order structures, stripped of their theological content but retaining the sense of sacred duty. The Brotherhood was not a church, but it had the structure of one: rules, ranks, rituals, and a founding mythology that transformed Maxson's act of desertion into something closer to revelation. Roger Maxson died of cancer in 2135. He was replaced by his son, who is referred to in the lore simply as Maxson II. And here is where the fissures begin, because Maxson II did not share his father's vision in one critical respect. Roger Maxson had intended the Brotherhood to be an organization that engaged with the broader wasteland community, that helped survivors, recruited worthy individuals from outside the Brotherhood's ranks, and served as a genuine force for civilizational recovery. Maxson II believed that the Brotherhood's technological assets were too valuable to risk through engagement with outsiders. He enacted a policy of isolation. The Brotherhood would stop recruiting from outside and would maintain its knowledge within its own familial lines. The tension between these two visions, the Brotherhood as an active civilizational force versus the Brotherhood as a closed, self-preserving order, is the central conflict of the faction's entire history. It echoes through every version of the Brotherhood that appears in the games, shaped differently by different leaders, resolved differently in different places, but never entirely settled. The West Coast chapter at Lost Hills eventually evolved into a deeply conservative, almost paranoid institution, more interested in acquiring technology than in the people that technology could help. When the new California Republic began to grow into a genuine democratic society, the Brotherhood's relationship with it soured over disagreements about technological access. The Brotherhood wanted to hoard, the NCR wanted to develop and distribute. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, the Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood had been nearly destroyed in an extended war with the NCR, reduced to hiding in a bunker beneath Henderson, Nevada, running on limited supplies and maintaining their identity through sheer stubbornness. Elder McNamara, the Mojave chapter's leader, has placed the chapter on lockdown. No one leaves, no one enters. The Brotherhood of the Mojave is preserving itself in the most literal possible way by ceasing to interact with the world at all. It is the endpoint of Maxson II's isolationist logic, taken to its extreme conclusion. The chapter is alive. Whether it is still serving its founding purpose is a different question. The East Coast chapter, founded when Elder Owen Lyons led a contingent of Brotherhood soldiers to Washington, D.C., as part of a mission to search for pre-war technology, developed along entirely different lines. Lyons encountered the scale of human suffering in the capital wasteland and found that he could not simply collect technology and leave. He began protecting the civilians. He began engaging with the community. He established a version of the Brotherhood that Roger Maxson might have recognized engaged, purposeful, spending its resources on the people around it rather than just the artifacts in its collection. The rest of the Brotherhood considered Lyons a heretic. The Outcasts, a splinter faction that broke from Lyons and established their own presence in the capital wasteland, maintained that the mission was technology retrieval, not humanitarian work, and that Lyons had corrupted the Order's purpose by turning it into a charity. They are not entirely wrong by the Brotherhood's own stated standards. They are also, in the way the game presents them, visibly smaller and colder and more isolated than the organization they left. Arthur Maxson, direct descendant of Roger Maxson and the Brotherhood's leader in Fallout 4, represents a synthesis that may or may not hold. He rebuilt the East Coast chapter into a formidable military force after the post-Lyons period of instability, reclaimed the Brotherhood's technological prestige, and led them in destroying the Institute. But his Brotherhood is also, visibly, an authoritarian structure with an almost messianic sense of its own righteousness. His speech aboard the Prydwen, the airship that serves as the chapter's mobile base, is extraordinary for what it reveals about how the Brotherhood's mythology has evolved. The original sin that Maxson committed, the FEV experiments, the institutional betrayal, the reason the Brotherhood was founded, has been alchemized into founding mythology. Maxson is not a deserter anymore. He is the deliverer, the founder, a figure approaching sainthood. And the questions the Brotherhood was founded to ask, who should have access to powerful technology, who can be trusted with knowledge that could destroy the world, have been replaced, in Arthur Maxson's version, by a single answer: us. Only us. This is perhaps the most honest ending the Brotherhood's internal argument ever reached, and the most disappointing one. The order that began as a rejection of institutional arrogance arrived, 200 years later, at a different but recognizable version of the same belief. What the Brotherhood has never fully confronted is the implication at the heart of its own founding. Roger Maxson executed scientists who told him they were following government orders. He found that answer insufficient. But the Brotherhood, in its various incarnations, has spent 200 years telling itself that its orders, its purposes, its classifications of who deserves access to what are different, that its authority is legitimate, that it knows better. The wasteland's history with institutions that knew better is not encouraging. Section 6. Pre-war America's Dark Machinery. The government behind the government. If you spend enough time reading terminal entries in the Fallout universe, a picture forms of pre-war America that is more disturbing in its specifics than the nuclear war that ended it. Because the nuclear war was a single catastrophic event, however complex its causes, what happened before the war was slower, more deliberate, more incremental, a series of choices made over decades, each one individually defensible within the logic of the moment, that collectively built a machine whose natural output was the destruction of civilization. The resource wars began in 2052 and ran to 2077. For 25 years, the world's major powers fought over the dwindling reserves of petroleum and other essential raw materials that industrial civilization depended upon. The United States, as the largest economy and the most militarily capable nation, positioned itself aggressively. It annexed Canada in 2076, a military occupation dressed in the language of continental security and resource protection. Canadian resistance was put down with a level of force that the American government did not discuss publicly, and the lore contains scattered references to atrocities during the annexation that were buried under official silence. The Anchorage Reclamation, the American military campaign to retake Anchorage, Alaska, from the Chinese forces that had seized it in 2066, was fought over 10 years and consumed resources on a scale that staggered the national economy. By the time General Constantine Chase led the winterized T-51 power armor units that finally reclaimed the city, the war had cost billions of dollars and thousands of lives and produced, as a strategic result, a reinforced stalemate. The Chinese were no longer in Alaska. They were also still in a position to threaten the rest of the Pacific theater. The domestic implications of the Sino-American War are visible throughout the Fallout world, in the artifacts that the games preserve like insects in amber, propaganda posters calling for vigilance against Chinese infiltrators, Department of Defense directives authorizing internment of Chinese-American citizens. The Yangtze's Captain Zhao, still waiting in Boston Harbor, is not just a reminder of the war, he is a reminder of the specific propaganda logic that defined the era, the framing of every Chinese person as a potential enemy agent, the suspension of rights and protections that the American government applied to its own citizens under the banner of national security. One of the most haunting details in Fallout 3's capital wasteland is the Rivet City terminal that contains the pre-war academic records of a doctor, Lee, a senior scientist who plays a significant role in the game's main quest. Her pre-war biography, assembled from fragments, describes a woman who navigated a world in which her ethnicity made her a suspect, in which her career required constant navigation of an institution that viewed her with baseline suspicion. She made it through. She was brilliant and determined, and she made it through. But the records show what that navigation cost, and the Fallout universe is full of people like her. People whose lives were shaped and constrained by the specific fears and hatreds of the pre-war era. The FEV program itself is one of the most instructive examples of how pre-war America's institutional logic worked. The forced evolutionary virus was originally developed by Vault-Tec, a defense contractor, as a potential cure for the new plague, a devastating disease that had begun killing large numbers of the American population in the years before the Great War. The scientific objective was genuine. The virus, engineered to integrate with human DNA and modify cellular behavior, might have led to treatments for any number of diseases. Early experiments were promising. Then the military got involved. The Department of Defense recognized that a virus capable of modifying cellular behavior had applications beyond medicine. A virus that could be designed to selectively alter human subjects, making them stronger, more resilient, perhaps more controllable, was a weapons program waiting to be born. The research was classified. The civilian scientists who had been working on the medical applications found themselves reporting to military oversight. The prisoners who became the test subjects had no knowledge of what was being done to them. The institutional logic followed its own internal groove. The potential military advantage justified the human cost, and the human cost was borne entirely by people who had no voice in the decision. By the time Roger Maxson found the scientists at Mariposa, the FEV program had been running long enough that the scientists involved had largely stopped thinking of themselves as doing anything unusual. They were following protocols. They were generating data. They were advancing the research. When Maxson killed Robert Anderson, Anderson's defense was that he was following orders, the same defense that had been made at Nuremberg, the same defense that every institutional atrocity in history has eventually produced, the same defense that Roger Maxson found completely insufficient, and that led to every soldier in Anderson's team being dead before the week was out. The pre-war government's relationship with its own population was a long sequence of broken promises wrapped in increasingly elaborate justifications. The vaults promised safety and delivered experiments. The annexation of Canada promised security and delivered occupation. The FEV program promised medical advancement and delivered weapons testing on prisoners. Each of these betrayals followed the same pattern: an institution claiming to serve the public interest while serving something else, power, profit, or the narrow preferences of a small group that had convinced itself its interests were universal. The Enclave's emergence from this system is not a corruption of pre-war American ideals. It is their logical conclusion. The shadow government that retreated to the oil rig did not appear from nowhere. It was built by the same institutional logic that built the Vault experiments and the FEV research and the resource wars. The people who formed the Enclave were not aberrations. They were, in many ways, the most consistent expression of the pre-war system's actual priorities: survival of the institution, preservation of the right kind of people, elimination of everything that did not serve those ends. There is a terminal entry in Fallout 4, found at a location called the Abandoned Shack, that contains the diary of a low-level government worker, someone who processed paperwork, who filed forms, who was part of the vast administrative infrastructure of the pre-war state. They write, with increasing anxiety, about the strange orders coming through the system in the months before the bombs fell. Transfers of personnel to unusual locations. Rerouting of supply chains that do not follow normal logistics. Requests for information about vault populations filed under classification codes they have never seen before. They do not understand what any of it means. They just process it, because that is the job, and file it, because that is the procedure. The diary ends 3 days before the bombs fall. The writer had no idea they were documenting the machinery of their own destruction. That bureaucratic normality in the face of the abyss is one of the details that makes the Fallout universe feel genuinely unsettling rather than simply bleak. The worst things that happened in the Fallout world were not exceptional. They were procedural. They had paperwork, they had chain of command authorization, and project designations and budget allocations. The apocalypse was administered. Section 7. Caesar's Legion, a scholar becomes a tyrant. There are characters in the Fallout universe who are easy to understand in their villainy. Dick Richardson wanted to kill everyone who was not like him. Frank Horrigan was a weapon that had been given opinions. But Edward Sallow, the man who would become Caesar, is something considerably more disturbing. A genuinely brilliant person who looked at the world with clear eyes and chose the worst possible response to what he saw. Sallow was born in 2226 near the Boneyard, in what had become the New California Republic. His father was killed by raiders when he was 2 years old. His mother sought protection from the Followers of the Apocalypse, a scholarly humanitarian organization dedicated to preserving pre-war knowledge and rebuilding civilization through education. While his mother worked for them as a cook and cleaner, the young Edward had access to their library and took their free courses. He was, by any measure, exceptionally intelligent, a student who absorbed languages, history, and anthropology with remarkable speed. The followers of the apocalypse are, in the Fallout universe's moral landscape, one of the genuinely good organizations, imperfect, sometimes naive, but committed to the idea that knowledge shared freely was the foundation of a better world. Edward Sallow grew up among them. He studied their philosophy, he took their educational offerings, and somewhere in the process he concluded that they were fundamentally wrong about how civilization worked, too optimistic about human nature, too committed to methods that would never produce results quickly enough in a world full of violence. In 2246, at the age of 20, Sallow was sent east on a followers' expedition to the Grand Canyon to learn the dialects of local tribes. He was accompanied by a physician named Bill Calhoun and, upon arriving in the region, met up with a Mormon missionary named Joshua Graham, who spoke several tribal dialects and had agreed to help with translations. Before the translation work could begin, the group was captured by the Blackfoot tribe, who intended to hold them for ransom. What happened next is the pivot on which the history of the American Southwest turns. Sallow observed the Blackfoot tribe and understood, with the analytical clarity that had made him exceptional as a scholar, that they were going to lose. They were at war with 7 other tribes simultaneously. They were outnumbered and outmatched. Their combat practices were ineffective by any objective standard. They were going to be destroyed, and Sallow and his companions would be destroyed with them. Against Calhoun's explicit objections, Sallow decided to use his knowledge to change the outcome. He taught the Blackfoot tribe how to clean and maintain firearms. He introduced them to small unit tactics drawn from his reading of military history. He showed them how to identify and exploit the weaknesses of enemies who outnumbered them. He explained the concept of divide and conquer, strike the weakest enemy first, absorb their resources, move to the next, and the Blackfoot adopted it with the enthusiasm of a people who had been told, for the first time, that they could win. They won. The 7 enemy tribes were defeated or absorbed, one by one, in a campaign that demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that no one in the region had seen before. When the last tribe was either destroyed or incorporated, Sallow crowned himself Caesar. Joshua Graham stayed, becoming his first legate. The expedition that had gone to study tribal dialects had instead become the founding moment of the most powerful military force east of the Colorado River. What Sallow built in the decades that followed was, he would tell you himself, a sociological experiment. He had read Julius Caesar's accounts of the Roman conquests, the Gallic Wars, the strategies of total dominance, the careful use of Roman cultural identity as a unifying force for a diverse collection of subject peoples. He had read Hegel and understood the concept of thesis meeting antithesis to produce synthesis. He believed the NCR, the closest thing the wasteland had to a democratic society, was doomed by its own democratic instincts, too slow, too divided, too tolerant of the corruption and inefficiency that democratic systems inevitably produced. He believed that a highly disciplined, culturally unified slave army organized around martial values and absolute hierarchy was not just more effective than the NCR model, but was, given the realities of the post-war world, more honest. The legionaries who served Caesar's legion had their tribal identities stripped from them, their languages, their traditions, their family loyalties, their personal histories, all of it was systematically erased and replaced with a single identity. They were legion. That identity was Roman in its aesthetics and its language, but it was entirely Sallow's creation, a deliberately invented culture deployed as a control mechanism. The tribes who were conquered had no idea that the civilization they were being assimilated into was invented by a 20-year-old scholar from the NCR who had been reading their archaeological and historical records, while they still considered him a hostage. Joshua Graham is, in many ways, the soul of the Legion's story. Born in what would become New Canaan, Utah, he was a Mormon missionary who believed in God and in the possibility of human redemption. He joined Caesar because he believed or convinced himself that he believed that the order Caesar was building served a greater purpose, that the violence of conquest was justified by the stability it would eventually produce. He served as Caesar's right hand for 30 years. He fought his legion's campaigns across Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. He was known as the Malpais Legate, and his reputation for tactical skill and personal ferocity was such that enemy forces genuinely feared him. Then, he lost the First Battle of Hoover Dam in 2277. The NCR's Chief Hanlon, a commander of the 1st Recon Sharpshooters and the NCR Rangers, used a tactical withdrawal into Boulder City to draw the Legion's forces into a trap. Graham, who did not adapt his strategy in the field, had his forces walk directly into prepared demolitions charges. The NCR detonated the explosives, drove the Legion back across the dam, and turned what had looked like a Legion victory into a rout. Caesar, to demonstrate that failure at any rank was unacceptable, ordered Graham covered in pitch and burned alive, then thrown into the Grand Canyon. The execution was public and total a message to every member of the Legion about the consequences of defeat. Graham survived. He climbed out of the Grand Canyon. He walked for 3 months to New Canaan, and the New Canaanites who found him burned black from his neck down. In constant agony, wrapped in bandages that had to be replaced daily, welcomed him home as if he had never left. The community that received him was the opposite of everything the Legion represented: generous, faithful, committed to the dignity of every individual regardless of their past. Graham's arc, explored in the Honest Hearts DLC for Fallout, New Vegas, is the moral heart of the Legion story. He is a man who committed enormous violence in service of an ideology he has had 30 years to reconsider, who is now trying to protect a small community of people he genuinely cares about, while grappling with the knowledge that he is still, in some part of himself, capable of the violence that defined his years as the Malpais legate. He does not pretend otherwise. He says plainly that he wants revenge against Caesar, that the anger is still there, and that the difference between righteous anger and destructive anger is one of the things he is still working out. Caesar himself, by the time the courier meets him in Fallout New Vegas, is dying. He has a brain tumor. He has an empire. He has an ideology so internally consistent and so thoroughly implemented that removing him from it would take a generation to undo, if it were undone at all. He will tell you, in a remarkably articulate conversation, exactly why he built what he built and exactly what he believes about the NCR and democratic civilization and the requirements of the post-war world. He is not stupid. He is not cruel in the way that mindless cruelty is cruel. He is a man who thought very clearly about the world and arrived at a philosophy that justifies everything he has done to it. The most chilling aspect of the conversation is that some of his diagnosis of the NCR's problems is accurate. The NCR is corrupt. It is slow. It is inefficient. Democratic institutions do produce exactly the kinds of gridlock and self-interest that Caesar identifies. His critique is the kind of critique that sounds reasonable, until you look at what he built as an alternative: a society in which women are property, conquered peoples are slaves, failure is punishable by death, and the entire value system is organized around the military utility of every individual to the collective. Caesar wrote a note before he died, intending it to name his successor. It said, "I am Caesar. I am the Legion. It ends with me." He had designed a system that could not survive without him, not because he made errors, but because he may have understood, at the end, that no system built entirely on the suppression of individual dignity can survive the death of the individual whose authority makes suppression seem necessary. The Legion fractured. Multiple men claimed the title of Caesar. They fought over his skeleton for the paper they thought would name who came next. The most brilliant tactician in the Fallout universe built an empire that outlasted him by perhaps months. The followers of the Apocalypse, the organization he left behind in his 20s because they were too idealistic to be effective, is still functioning in the Fallout TV series 200 years later. Slow and imperfect and underpowered, but still there, still trying to bring knowledge to people who need it. The Institute, the Synth Question, and what consciousness costs. Somewhere beneath the ruins of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a city exists. It is clean and well lit and carefully maintained. Its residents eat reasonably well, have access to advanced medicine, and spend their working lives on scientific projects that push the boundaries of what anyone in the post-war world would consider possible. In 2287, the year Fallout 4 takes place, the Institute is the most technologically advanced human organization in the wasteland, by a significant margin. The Institute also makes people, specific people, Gen 3 synths, synthetic humans so perfectly constructed, down to the cellular level, that even the most sophisticated medical equipment cannot distinguish them from biological humans. Synths who have been implanted with carefully crafted memories, released into the surface world, and used for various purposes that the Institute's leadership considers necessary for their ongoing research and survival. The philosophical problem at the center of Fallout 4, the question the game raises and leaves deliberately, uncomfortably unresolved, is this: are the synths people? The Institute's official position is no. Synths are machines, extraordinarily sophisticated machines, but machines nonetheless. They are tools, built by human hands for human purposes, and the fact that they can hold convincing conversations and exhibit what appears to be emotional distress does not change their fundamental nature. Sean, the Institute's leader, argues this position with genuine conviction and a certain cold clarity. He does not enjoy cruelty for its own sake. He simply does not believe the synths he has created have the kind of inner life that would make cruelty meaningful. They are very good at appearing to have such an inner life, but appearances are not truth. Nick Valentine would like to have a word about that. Nick Valentine is a pre-war detective whose personality and memories were encoded from a living person, a man who actually existed before the Great War, who loved a woman named Jenny Martinez, who carried that love so completely into whatever form he has now that 200 years later it is still the thing that drives him. He is not quite like the standard Gen 3 synths that the Institute manufactures. He is a prototype, a bridge model built when the Institute was still figuring out how to create synthetic personalities that were stable and coherent enough to be useful. He does not have the technical certainty of his own nature that the Institute claims. He is deeply, genuinely uncertain whether what he feels is real or simulated. That uncertainty is the most honest thing about him, and it is what makes conversations with Nick Valentine some of the most resonant in the game. He does not claim more than he knows. He does not pretend that the question of his personhood is settled. He just lives as carefully and as decently as he can with the uncertainty intact. Dima, the older prototype synth encountered in the Far Harbor DLC, offers a different perspective. Dima has been in existence long enough and has accumulated enough independent experience that the question of his origins as an Institute creation has become almost secondary to the fact of his autonomous existence. He has built a community. He has made choices that the Institute never programmed him to make. He has memories that he developed himself through lived experience stored in external systems because his original memory capacity was insufficient for the accumulated weight of 2 centuries. Dima also, the sole survivor discovers, has committed an act of violence in defense of the people he protects, an act he chose to hide rather than confront, because the revelation would destabilize the fragile peace he had built on the island. Whether that choice represents genuine moral agency or an extremely sophisticated simulation of moral agency is exactly the kind of question the game wants you to sit with. The synth question bleeds into a question about the sole survivor themselves. This theory that the protagonist of Fallout 4 might be a synth is one of the most debated in Fallout fandom. The argument goes like this: the sole survivor was in cryogenic stasis for 200 years. Cryogenic stasis of that duration, with that level of precision, is not obviously possible with 2077 technology, even advanced technology. The Institute, with its understanding of synthetic biology and memory encoding, could theoretically have created a synthetic version of the original sole survivor at some point after the bombs fell and placed that synth in the vault pod, complete with implanted memories of a pre-war life that never technically happened to this individual. Dima himself raises the possibility in a conversation in Far Harbor, noting that the sole survivor's ability to express complete certainty about their pre-war identity is no different from the certainty a synth with implanted memories would express. The game does not confirm this theory. It also does not refute it. It is built into the architecture of the Far Harbor questline with enough specificity, the parallel between Kasumi Nakano, who fears she is a synth but cannot be sure, and the sole survivor who has no comparable doubt that it is clearly intentional. Whether it represents a true ambiguity in the game's intended fiction or simply a player-facing philosophical question is something that has been argued endlessly, and there is something rather Fallout-ish about the fact that the answer may simply never come. What the Institute story does with unambiguous clarity is trace the same arc as every other powerful organization in the Fallout universe. It began with genuine, admirable purpose. MIT's pre-war research department survived the apocalypse and evolved into an organization that, in the centuries following the Great War, made genuine contributions to human welfare, developing agricultural technologies, medical advances, and eventually the android program that was intended to produce synthetic human labor, capable of doing the dangerous work that the post-war world required in abundance. At some point, the process became the goal. The synthesis program, no pun intended, grew from a practical tool into an obsession. The question of whether synthetic life could be made indistinguishable from biological life became more compelling than the question of why that would be useful. The leadership structure calcified. The institute retreated below the surface and cut off its connections to the surface world, with the exception of the operations that served its research needs, collecting genetic material, replacing surface individuals with synth duplicates, conducting experiments on surface populations. What the institute did to the Commonwealth, from the perspective of the people living there, was impose an invisible terror. Anyone could be a synth. Your neighbor, who seemed a little different last month. Your spouse, whose behavior changed slightly after they returned from a trip. The railroad, the underground network dedicated to helping synths escape the institute, exists because there were enough people in the Commonwealth who decided that whatever the synths were, they deserved better than what they were getting, and the existential dread their existence created in the surface population was itself a form of violence. The Institute's argument that synths are not people, that Gen 3 synths are sophisticated machines with no more claim to personhood than a very complex protectron, runs directly into the problem that the distinction between a very complex machine and a conscious being is genuinely unclear. Not unclear in the Fallout universe specifically, but unclear as a philosophical matter in the real world, where the question of what consciousness is and what is required to produce it remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in philosophy and neuroscience. The Institute built something capable of dreaming. One of the scientists in the Institute specifically notes that there is evidence the Gen 3 synths dream, and then declined to consider what that might mean. That refusal to consider the implications of what they had built is the Institute's defining failure and the mirror of every other institutional failure in the Fallout universe. The Enclave refused to consider the humanity of the Wasteland's population. Vault-Tec refused to consider the humanity of their test subjects. The pre-war government refused to consider the humanity of the prisoners it used for FEV research. The Institute refused to consider the humanity of the beings it created. Each refusal followed the same logic. These people, these beings, do not count in the way that we count, and therefore, the way we treat them does not require justification. The sole survivor, coming from a world where such questions were not daily facts of life, walks into the Institute's clean corridors and has to decide which side of the question to come down on. The game's structure allows for every possible answer, and none of them is obviously correct. That moral ambiguity, that refusal to give the player an easy out, is one of the things that makes the Institute arc one of the more genuinely challenging things in recent Fallout, even if the execution is uneven. Section 9. The Dunwich Mystery. Something older than the bombs. Not all the mysteries of the Fallout universe are about politics or ideology. Some of them are older and stranger and have nothing to do with the particular failures of the pre-war American state. Some of them feel, when you trace their edges carefully, like they were waiting under the surface of the world long before the first nuclear program was conceived. The Dunwich Mystery is one of those. It begins, for most players, with a building. In Fallout 3's capital Wasteland, there is a structure called the Dunwich Building, a derelict commercial office block that sits in the southeastern part of the map. On the surface, it is not obviously different from dozens of other ruins the lone wanderer can explore. Ghouls, scattered furniture, broken equipment, the remnants of an ordinary working day interrupted by the end of civilization. But descend far enough into the building's lower levels and something changes. The environmental design grows heavier, more deliberate. There is a stone obelisk in a basement cave, surrounded by human skulls arranged with obvious care. Strange text is carved into its surface. Feral ghouls in this area seem older and somehow stranger than the ones found elsewhere, as though something about this location has affected them differently. The obelisk, follow-up lore, and a side quest called The Dark Heart of Blackhall clarify, is dedicated to an entity named Ugg Qualtoth. The Dunwich family, specifically a man named Richard Dunwich, was connected to this entity's worship. The name Dunwich is not accidental. H.P. Lovecraft wrote a story called The Dunwich Horror, set in a fictional Massachusetts town of the same name, involving an entity of vast and incomprehensible power that ordinary human beings were profoundly ill-equipped to face. The Fallout developers were aware of this connection. They built it deliberately. And then, in Fallout 4, set in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the same state as Lovecraft's fictional Dunwich, the Dunwich thread continues. There is a location called Dunwich Borers, a marble quarry that was operated before the Great War by a company called Dunwich Borers LLC. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward raider settlement, forged gang members who had come to collect iron and then stayed, driven to strange behavior by something in the mine below. Descend through the quarry's levels. Read the terminal entries left by the pre-war management and the pre-war workers. Watch the visions flashes of the past that the sole survivor experiences as they go deeper. Images of suited executives and workers in hard hats engaged in what looks, at first, like ordinary construction. Then look more carefully at what the visions show. The workers kneeling, a raised platform, something being brought up from deep underground. The management of Dunwich Borers LLC knew exactly what they were building toward. Tim Schutz, one of the site managers, accessed a tunnel leading to a subterranean temple and immediately notified management, adding a note about how the other managers might begin to realize that the marble quarrying operation was merely a cover for what the company was actually looking for. Management's response was to order him to lure the other managers down to the temple and stall them pending their arrival. At the bottom of the quarry, past the irradiated pool that only reveals its secrets to anyone willing to dive into contaminated water and navigate a submerged tunnel, is a statue. Enormous, ancient, clearly predating the Great War, and possibly predating recorded history in this part of the world. It has a face with blind eyes that appear, somehow, to be watching. Kremva's tooth, a unique and extremely powerful sacrificial blade, rests on an altar nearby. What exactly Kremv is, what Ugg-Qualtoth is, what relationship they have to each other and to the Dunwich Corporation across two different games set in different cities, the Fallout universe has never explicitly stated. The intentional parallels to Lovecraft are clear. The ancient, incomprehensible entity, the human cult that serves it, the physical and psychological damage suffered by those who get too close, the sense that the ordinary horror of nuclear apocalypse is, in this specific location, layered over something far older and far less explicable. The Fallout Bible, in one of its entries, notes that supernatural or paranormal elements were intentionally incorporated into the Fallout universe from early in the design process, but were kept deliberately vague, present enough to be unsettling, undefined enough to resist easy explanation. The Dunwich thread is perhaps the clearest example of this approach in action. Something is there. Something has been there for a very long time. The pre-war Dunwich Corporation found it and began serving it. 200 years later, the effect lingers in the building and in the quarry, strong enough that people who spend time in those locations begin to lose the edges of their ordinary functioning. The question of whether this represents an actual supernatural entity in the Fallout universe, or simply the psychological effect of ancient human construction that was designed to produce exactly this kind of disorientation in anyone who encountered it, is unresolved. The Fallout universe's approach to the question is characteristically oblique. Both explanations are consistent with the evidence available. The game gives you the facts and declines to interpret them. What it does with unmistakable clarity is connect the Dunwich mystery to the franchise's recurring interest in the things that human beings do when they encounter power they do not understand. The pre-war Dunwich family did not worship Ugg-Qualtoth because they were stupid or insane. They worshipped it because they experienced something in its proximity that convinced them that this was the appropriate response. Whatever that something was, genuine contact with an entity, psychological suggestion from the ancient construction's design, something else entirely, the worship-produced behavior that lasted generations, informed a corporate strategy and still lingers in the ruins of two buildings in two different cities, decades after every member of the family and every employee of the company are dead. Something in those ruins is patient. Something in those ruins is still waiting. What it is waiting for is the one mystery the Fallout universe seems genuinely committed to never solving. 10. Loose threads, the mysterious stranger. and the Wace's unanswered questions. There is a man in a fedora and a tan trench coat. He is there when you need him, appearing from nowhere in the heat of combat, firing his revolver with impossible accuracy, and then vanishing before you can turn around and speak to him. He has appeared in every mainline Fallout game. He has never introduced himself. He has never explained why he helps you. Nick Valentine, in Fallout 4, has an open case file on him, observations collected over Valentine's long career in the Commonwealth, documenting appearances and physical description, and absolutely nothing about identity or motivation. The file is entirely inconclusive and deeply frustrated. The mysterious stranger is, depending on your interpretation, many things. He is a game mechanic, a perk reward that gives players a chance to summon a powerful ally in VATS. He is a narrative joke, the classic film noir figure of the man in the hat who knows things he is not explaining. He is a philosophical statement about the Fallout universe's relationship to player agency, the ghost of help that appears without being summoned, without explanation, and without asking anything in return. But there is evidence, scattered through the games with characteristic obliqueness, that he is also something more specific. In Fallout New Vegas, there is a character called the Lonesome Drifter, a wandering guitar player who camps near the El Dorado gas and service station north of Las Vegas. If you stop and talk to him, he will tell you about his father. His father was a mysterious man, he says, a stranger really to his own family. The word mysterious appears directly above the word stranger in the dialogue options, placed with the care of someone who wants you to notice. The Lonesome Drifter carries a unique revolver called the Mysterious Magnum. When you draw it, you hear the same guitar notes that play when the mysterious stranger appears. The stranger, in the New Vegas version of his perk, carries a similar weapon. The implication is almost explicit. The mysterious stranger is, or was at some point, the Lonesome Drifter's father, a man who appeared in crises, helped with impossible precision, and then was gone again, present and absent in the same moment, defined by his absence as much as his help. Nick Valentine's case file adds a detail that the other games do not. Valentine has been trying to identify the stranger for as long as he has been operating in the Commonwealth. He cannot. Despite exceptional detective skills and 2 centuries of accumulated investigative experience, the mysterious stranger has left no trail that leads anywhere useful. He predates Nick's own timeline of appearances. He has been seen helping people across the wasteland for at least 200 years. He is always the same physical person, middle-aged, the same coat, the same hat. He has not aged. The theory that the mysterious stranger is not a single person but a title, a role passed from one individual to the next, each inheriting the coat and the hat, and the reputation is appealing in its practicality, but difficult to reconcile with the consistency of the physical description across 2 centuries. The theory that he is a ghost, the spirit of a man who died protecting others and was unable to stop doing so after death, is more poetic and fits the atmosphere of the character's appearances without resolving anything. What the mysterious stranger represents, functionally, in the Fallout universe, is the idea that the wasteland contains things that do not follow ordinary rules. Not just the supernatural horror of the Dunwich thread, but something more ambiguous, the sense that the world, even in its devastated state, has elements of structure or purpose that are not visible from ground level. The stranger appears when needed. He helps. He leaves. He was there for the Vault Dweller and the Chosen One, and the Lone Wanderer, and the Courier, and the Sole Survivor, which means he has been at the center of every major conflict in post-war American history without leaving a single verifiable trace. Whether that is intentional design, whether whoever or whatever the stranger is has chosen to be present at these moments, or simply the accumulated coincidence of a wasteland populated by the same mythology, producing the same apparition wherever people face catastrophic choices, is the question. The game never answers. Nick Valentine's frustration at the case file's emptiness is the appropriate response. Some mysteries are there to be solved. Some are there to remind you that not everything has a solution. The children of Adam present a different kind of unanswered question, one that sits at the intersection of theology, genetics, and the strange physics of a world irradiated beyond conventional recognition. The cult that worships nuclear radiation as the gift of their god Adam is easy to dismiss. From the outside, as simple delusion. They live in intensely radioactive areas. They drink irradiated water. They consider those who survive such practices to be blessed. They await an event they call the Great Divide, a final atomic event that will complete the creation of a new world and usher the worthy into something beyond ordinary existence. Many of their members have radiation immunity. Not a slight resistance, but genuine immunity. They can stand in areas that would kill an unprotected person in minutes and walk away intact. The lore explanation for this is biological mutation generations of radiation exposure producing populations with genetic adaptations. This is scientifically coherent, at least within the Fallout universe's somewhat loose relationship with radiation physics. What is less coherent, and what the Far Harbor DLC deliberately leaves unresolved, is the Mother of the Fog. She is a figure venerated by the children of Adam on the island of Mount Desert Island, believed to be a messenger of Adam himself, a spiritual entity who appears to the faithful in moments of need. There are notes left by her across the island, practical and specific. There is a physical location where she can be encountered, briefly, that suggests she is a living person, a hermit, who has chosen to represent herself to the cult as something supernatural. But the encounter is ambiguous enough that the alternative that she is exactly what the children believe her to be is not ruled out by anything the game shows you. The Fallout universe does not commit to the proposition that gods exist, but it does commit to the proposition that the post-war world contains things that resist easy classification, that the question of what constitutes genuine divine contact versus psychological projection is impossible to answer with certainty, and that the people who organize their lives around the possibility of the former are not obviously less rational than the people who organize their lives around the certainty of the latter. The factions of the wasteland are, in many ways, all performing different versions of the same ritual, finding a way to make meaning in a world that ended. The children of Adam made their meaning from the thing that destroyed the world. There is a logic to that, even if it is a logic that leads directly into irradiated pools of water and ecstatic prayers to the thing that killed civilization. Section 11. The Player Character Mysteries. Who are you really? Every Fallout game gives you a character. A face, a name, a backstory, a vault. You step out into the wasteland as someone, the Vault Dweller from Vault 13, the Chosen One from Arroyo, the Lone Wanderer from Vault 101, the Courier from the Mojave, the Sole Survivor from Vault 111. Each of these characters is defined by where they come from and what has happened to them. Each of them is also, in ways the games rarely make explicit, surrounded by questions that the lore raises without fully answering. The Vault Dweller of Fallout 1 is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential characters in the universe's history. They destroyed the Master's army, eliminated the Mariposa military base and its FEV production, and then, and this is the part that the official record is careful not to discuss too openly, were exiled from Vault 13 for knowing too much about the world. The Vault Overseer decided that someone who had seen the wasteland and fought in it and survived was too dangerous to allow back into the Vault's carefully managed social order. The knowledge they carried would destabilize what the Overseer was trying to maintain. The Vault Dweller walked away into the Northern California wilderness. They settled eventually, founded a community, had a family. Their granddaughter would become the Chosen One of Fallout 2. Their story, as documented in a journal reproduced in the Fallout Bible, is a meditation on the cost of having been the person who did the thing that needed to be done. They missed the Vault for a long time. They built something good in the desert. They died eventually, having lived a full life that they apparently never entirely stopped being ambivalent about. The game never shows you most of this. It is there in the lore, patient and quiet, for those who go looking. The Chosen One of Fallout 2 carries a different weight. They were sent on their quest by the village elder, their grandmother, though this relationship is never made explicit in the game itself, to find the GECK, the Garden of Eden creation kit, that would allow their small tribal community to survive the increasingly harsh conditions of the wasteland. The Chosen One is the descendant of the Vault Dweller, raised in a community shaped by that heritage, and the game plays this for thematic resonance without making it the explicit focus of the narrative. You are carrying something forward. What you are carrying it toward is still being worked out. The Courier of Fallout. New Vegas is perhaps the most existentially interesting of the player characters, precisely because of their relationship to their own almost death. The game opens with the Courier being shot in the head and left in a shallow grave in the Mojave Desert. They are dug out, transported to Good Springs, and slowly nursed back to health by a doctor named Mitchell. The beginning of the game is, structurally, a resurrection. Someone who was dead, coming back to life with incomplete memories, and a personal mystery: what was in the package they were carrying, and why did someone want them dead badly enough to do it personally? The answer unfolds across the game's narrative as a study in the courier's capacity for identity. You are, mechanically, whoever you decide to be. You can align with any of the game's major factions. You can be merciful or ruthless. You can understand the political landscape of the Mojave with deep nuance, or navigate it entirely on the basis of personal loyalty. But the Lonesome Road DLC, the final piece of New Vegas content, reveals something that the base game deliberately withholds. The courier has been here before. They walked the Lonesome Road once, before the events of the game. Their choices during that earlier passage, through this part of the wasteland choices the player never made, because they happened before the game's story began, had consequences. An entire community was erased, not through malice but through what the DLC frames as a kind of negligence, a failure to understand the weight of certain decisions. Ulysses, the antagonist of Lonesome Road, is a man whose identity the courier destroyed without knowing they were doing it. He is the courier's mirror, someone who also lost everything and had to rebuild themselves from nothing, but who drew a different set of conclusions from the experience. He wants the courier to understand the cost of choices before they are made. He wants them to carry the weight of what they did, even unknowingly. Whether they do is up to the player. The sole survivor of Fallout 4, as discussed briefly in the Institute section, carries the synth replacement theory as an unresolved question. But there is another layer to their story that the game handles with surprising gentleness. They are a person out of time. The Commonwealth they wake up in, 200 years after they went under, has no use for the grief they carry about the pre-war world. Their son has grown old and died in the same time they were asleep. The political structures they understood have been replaced by factions they have never heard of. The city they lived in is rubble. Even the specific rubble of their specific house is visible from outside Vault 111, a detail so particular it can be hard to look at directly. The sole survivor's motivation, in the main quest, is the search for their son, now an old man who has grown up to lead the very organization that, depending on your interpretation, is the game's primary villain. The emotional complexity of this revelation that the child you were cryogenically preserved trying to protect grew up in the world you failed to protect him from and built something extraordinary and terrible with his life is not something the game always handles with the grace it deserves. But the premise is profound. What do you owe to someone whose life you were absent for, through no choice of either of yours? The player characters of Fallout are not heroes in the conventional sense. They are all, in various ways, displaced people removed from their contexts, their communities, their ordinary lives, and dropped into circumstances that require them to become something they were not before. The Vault Dweller was a sheltered Vault resident who became a wasteland savior. The courier was a delivery person who became the deciding factor in a war for the Mojave. The sole survivor was a pre-war civilian with a law degree and family photographs who became whatever the player made them, against a backdrop of grief and dislocation that never entirely recedes. What you do with that displacement is the question the series keeps asking. Do you rebuild what was lost? Do you accept that what was lost cannot be rebuilt and try to build something new? Do you decide that the whole project of civilization is not worth the effort and find some accommodation with the ruins? The Fallout universe does not have a preferred answer to this. It has factions that embody different answers and leaves the player to choose among them, or to carve out some fourth option that none of them imagined. Section 12. Connections across the games, the universe stitched together. The Fallout universe, across its many games and studios and decades of development, is not a seamlessly unified world. There are inconsistencies, retcons, pieces of lore that fit awkwardly against other pieces, choices that the Bethesda games made that the original Black Isle games would not have made. Anyone who has spent real time in Fallout fandom knows this, and the debates about which versions of the lore take precedence, the Fallout Bible, the Black Isle original intent, the Bethesda reinterpretation are among the most genuinely complex discussions in any game's fan community. But if you step back from the details of inconsistency and look at the broad architecture, something emerges that is more impressive than the inconsistencies suggest. The games are, in their deep structure, in conversation with each other. The Mojave Wasteland of Fallout. New Vegas is an extension of the California of Fallout 1 and 2, populated by factions and individuals whose histories trace directly back to those earlier games. The followers of the apocalypse are still operating, still running their medical and educational programs, still committed to the project of knowledge preservation without violence. The New California Republic is what happened when the loose confederation of settlements around Shady Sands in Fallout 2 developed and grew and faced the problems that all democratic societies eventually face: corruption, bureaucratic inertia, military overextension. The NCR's presence in the Mojave, a long way from their California heartland, is the consequence of decisions made in games set over 40 years earlier. Their relationship with Hoover Dam, their desire to secure the dam's power generation for their expanding territory, follows directly from the resource priorities that a growing society requires. The Legion's encampment east of the Colorado River is the long shadow of Edward Sallow's decision, 30 years before the events of New Vegas, to crown himself and build an empire. Everything in New Vegas has history. Every faction is carrying the weight of choices made before the game begins. The Fallout Bible, written by Chris Avellone, was an attempt to formalize this history to create a consistent reference document for all the lore that had accumulated across Fallout 1, Fallout 2, and the various spin-offs and side material. It is remarkable not just for what it contains, but for its tone. Avellone writes about the Fallout world with the care and attention of someone who has been living in it for a long time, who finds it genuinely interesting as a place, who wants readers to understand its logic and its internal consistency. The Fallout Bible's entries on Brahmin evolution and pre-war American history and the development of various factions read less like official game documentation and more like someone sitting across from you at a table, telling you about a world they find genuinely compelling. Many of the details that have become foundational Fallout lore, the specific timeline of the resource wars, the sequence of events at Mariposa, the structure of the Vault-Tec experiment program, the precise nature of the Enclave's ideology and goals are either established or significantly developed in the Fallout Bible. When Bethesda acquired the franchise and began developing their own games, the Bible served as a reference and a foundation, though not an inviolable one. The Bethesda games expanded the universe, added new elements, and occasionally modified things that the original designers had established, not always with the same care. Not always for reasons that the franchise's core fans found compelling. The transition of Fallout from an isometric turn-based RPG to an open-world first-person experience is the most significant change the franchise has undergone, and its effects on the storytelling are real. The original games could present the Vault Dweller and the Chosen One as relatively blank characters, defined primarily by the player's skill choices and moral decisions, because the gameplay context naturally abstracted away the physical reality of being in the world. When Fallout 3 put the player directly behind the Lone Wanderer's eyes, walking through the ruins of Washington, D.C., in real time, the character's relationship to the world became more immediate, and also, necessarily, somewhat more prescribed. The world needed to be designed to produce a certain quality of experience, moments of awe, moments of horror, moments of unexpected beauty that the earlier games could achieve through description and suggestion, but that the first-person format required to construct directly. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 works partly because of the design work that goes into its lower levels, the careful placement of environmental details, the specific sound design, the way the lighting degrades as you descend. In Fallout 1, the equivalent location would have been described, perhaps with a detailed paragraph or two, and players' imaginations would have done the rest. Neither approach is obviously superior. They simply serve different strengths of their respective formats. What connects all the Fallout games most deeply is not their mechanics but their thematic preoccupations. The question of who deserves to survive and who gets to decide. The question of what you owe to the people who came before you, given that their choices shaped the world you are living in. The question of whether technology accelerates human flourishing or human destruction, and who gets to draw that line. The question of what civilization actually requires, whether order without compassion is civilization at all, whether democracy is worth defending when it is messy and inefficient and full of the corruption that every democratic society eventually has to address. These are not questions that any Fallout game fully answers. They are questions that the games ask with different inflections, through different factions, in different settings, and leave open. The Mojave Wasteland at the end of Fallout. New Vegas, whichever ending you choose, is not a place where things have been solved. It is a place where things have been decided, for now pending the next crisis. The Commonwealth at the end of Fallout 4 is whatever the sole survivor made of it, marked by the choices they made and the buildings that are still standing. The capital wasteland of Fallout 3, with its purified water finally flowing, is better than it was, but the problems the water does not fix are still there. The recurring Easter eggs that knit the games together are part of this interconnection. The mysterious stranger across all 6 games. Vault Boy in his various incarnations. The pre-war brands Nuka-Cola, Sunset Sarsaparilla, Abraxo Cleaner, Sugar Bombs, Mentats, Buff-Out, the various energy weapons manufacturers that create the sense of a unified commercial culture, even across games set on opposite coasts and 200 years apart. The small details that reward players who have spent time in multiple games, recognizing the NCR flag in a background terminal, catching a reference to a character from Fallout 2 Inches, a New Vegas terminal entry, noticing that a weapon in Fallout 4 is the descendant of a weapon that appeared in the original game. The Fallout universe is large enough to hold contradictions and small enough to feel like a place. That combination, the genuine scale of the world alongside the specific, human-scale details that make it feel inhabited, is what has sustained the fandom's engagement for more than 2 decades. Section 13. Van Buren and the Ghosts of What Might Have Been. Before the Bethesda Fallout games existed, before Fallout 3 became the game that millions of players know, there was another Fallout 3. It had a different name, Van Buren, a development code name referencing Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, and it was being made by Black Isle Studios, the team that had created the first 2 games. It was canceled in December 2003 when Interplay Entertainment, Black Isle's parent company, faced financial collapse and made the decision to prioritize console development over the expensive, time-consuming work of finishing a PC role-playing game. What Van Buren would have been is documented in extraordinary detail, thanks to the leaking of a 700-page design document to the fan community and the subsequent release of a tech demo that, while unpolished, gives some sense of what the game's architecture was aiming for. The story Van Buren intended to tell was set in the American Southwest in the year 2253, just 11 years after the events of Fallout 2, much closer to the earlier game's timeline than any subsequent Fallout title. The player character would have been referred to as the Prisoner, someone who woke up in a fully automated prison facility called Tibbets, with no memory of how they got there or why. The main antagonist, a man named Victor Presper, was an NCR scientist who had gone rogue and was pursuing a plan that would have made the Enclave's FEV scheme look measured by comparison. Presper intended to use a satellite, a ballistic weapons platform called B-001, that had survived the Great War in orbit, to trigger a second nuclear event that would sterilize most of the remaining human population, leaving only the people he considered genetically and socially suitable to rebuild civilization. In the rubble of this second apocalypse, Presper planned to emerge from the Boulder Dome, a scientific facility in Colorado, with a carefully selected population, and begin again. The resonance with the Enclave's plan in Fallout 2 is intentional, but distinct. Presper was not a government survivor or a military ideologue. He was a scientist, a former follower of the apocalypse, someone who had grown up in the same organization that Edward Sallow grew up in and reached a completely different but equally terrible conclusion from the same evidence. Where Sallow built an empire, Presper was planning an extinction event. Both men started from genuine frustration with the limitations of post-war civilization and arrived at responses that the word disproportionate does not begin to cover. Van Buren's location, the American Southwest, specifically Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah, was the region that would eventually become the setting of Fallout New Vegas. This is not a coincidence. Many of the people who worked on Van Buren went on to found Obsidian Entertainment and were the team behind New Vegas. The Van Buren design documents describe Caesar's Legion in its early form as the Caesar Raiders, a tribal force that Sallow was in the early stages of organizing. The burned man Joshua Graham appears in a different form, under the name the Hanged Man. The geographic setting is the same. The political tensions between the NCR's expansionism and the tribal cultures of the Southwest are the same. Chris Avallone, one of the primary designers of Van Buren, confirmed that New Vegas drew heavily on the design work done for the canceled game. The followers of the Apocalypse, the NCR, and the Legion are all direct descendants of their Van Buren counterparts. The new plague, the disease that FEV was originally designed to cure, was a central element of the Van Buren story that survived in modified form in New Vegas. Tibbetts Prison was actually canonized in the Fallout universe, appearing in references in both New Vegas and the subsequent Fallout TV series. What Van Buren contained that New Vegas could not incorporate, because it required more space and a different narrative structure, was an extraordinarily complex moral framework organized around the player's choice of how to address the prisoner's identity. The design documents describe a system in which the player could choose to be genuinely guilty of whatever crime put them in Tibbetts, wrongfully convicted, or something in between, and that choice would cascade through the entire game's social dynamics, affecting how every faction and every individual responded to the prisoner. A genuinely guilty man asking for help from the followers of the Apocalypse was making a different kind of request than an innocent person asking for the same thing. The game was designed to track the distinction. There was also a companion in Van Buren who has become legendary among the game's enthusiasts, Bajar, short for Brain in a Jar. Bajar was, exactly as the acronym suggests, a disembodied human brain floating in a container of biogel, connected to a mechanical support system. They were highly intelligent, extraordinarily helpful, and could be transported by the prisoner to various locations throughout the game world. They sometimes asked for chemicals to break up the monotony of being a preserved brain, which the lore presents with a deadpan matter-of-factness that is very specifically Fallout in its humor. Bajar never made it into any released game. They exist only in the design documents and in the imaginations of the people who read them. The Boulder Dome in Colorado, which Van Buren planned as one of the game's major locations, becomes interesting in the context of the Fallout TV series' move toward Colorado for its third season. The show's first 2 seasons introduced wetware technology, the use of human brains as computer components, as a significant plot element. The Van Buren design documents established the Boulder Dome as the location where wetware technology was pioneered in the Fallout universe. Whether the show will draw on that connection remains to be seen, but the thread is there for the drawing. The cancellation of Van Buren was, by any account, a genuine loss for the franchise. Not because the game Bethesda eventually made in 2008 was bad, Fallout 3 was a remarkable achievement in many ways and brought Fallout to an enormous new audience, but because the Black Isle version of Fallout 3 would have been a continuation of the storytelling tradition of the first 2 games in ways that Bethesda's version, by design and by the different audience it was aiming for, was not. Van Buren would have been dense, challenging, and morally complex in ways that required players to read and think and make decisions that did not have easy answers. What survived from Van Buren, in New Vegas and in the broader lore, is some of the best material in the franchise. The Legion's origin story, the Burned Man's arc, the NCR's political struggles, the philosophical debates about power and accountability, and the limits of democratic governance that run through New Vegas like a current, these ideas came from the same source that Van Buren came from, a group of writers and designers who understood the Fallout universe at a level of detail and commitment that produced work that has aged extraordinarily well. Section 14. The deepest lore things Bethesda may never explain. Every long-running fiction accumulates mysteries it cannot resolve. Sometimes this is deliberate questions left open because the ambiguity is itself meaningful, because a definitive answer would collapse something that needs to remain open. Sometimes it is accidental threads that were introduced and then abandoned, details that conflict with later additions, moments that seemed important at the time and were never followed up on. The Fallout universe, across 25 years and multiple development studios and 1 prestige television series, has accumulated a considerable collection of both kinds. The Marked Men are a faction that appears in the Lonesome Road DLC for Fallout New Vegas, and they are among the stranger creations in the Fallout universe. They are Wastelanders, former soldiers, couriers, Ordinary people who were in the Divide, the region along the edge of the Mojave Wasteland, when a catastrophic event destroyed the area. The destruction flayed them, literally stripping their skin, exposing them to radiation and debris in a way that should have killed them, but instead left them in a permanent, agonizing state between life and death. They are not ghouls, exactly. They are not super mutants. They are something specific to what happened in the Divide, something the radiation of that particular devastation produced in the people who survived it. The marked men have a kind of terrible coherence. They hate everyone, but they particularly hate the forces that were fighting in the Divide when it was destroyed both the NCR and Caesar's Legion. They attack everyone with the focused intensity of people who have nothing left to lose, which they do not, because what they have lost is too complete to calculate. Ulysses, the antagonist of Lonesome Road, knows them and navigates among them with a mixture of grief and pragmatism. They are, in a way, the collateral damage that the game's narrative asks you to reckon with the people who got caught in something they did not choose and were made into something they did not ask to become. The question the marked men raise, without answering, is whether what happened to them could happen elsewhere. The Divide was unique in the nature and concentration of its particular devastation. But the Fallout universe is full of places where unusual combinations of radiation and specific environmental conditions have produced unusual biological results. The children of Adam's radiation immunity, the particular properties of the glowing sea in Massachusetts, the effects of the fog on the island of Far Harbor. What the marked men are is never fully categorized or explained, and there is something appropriate about that. Not everything in the wasteland needs a complete scientific explanation. Some things are just what happens when the world is broken badly enough. The Mothership Zeta DLC for Fallout 3 is one of the more controversial entries in the franchise's extended content, raising questions about the Fallout universe's relationship to the extraterrestrial that the main games have always handled with deliberate ambiguity. The evidence for alien presence in the Fallout universe goes back to the first game, which contained random encounter events involving alien ships. Various pieces of in-game media reference UFO sightings, alien encounter reports, and unexplained lights in the sky. The Fallout universe's pre-war culture, frozen in a 1950s aesthetic, naturally includes the UFO mythology that was central to that era's popular consciousness. Mothership Zeta takes the lone wanderer aboard an actual alien spacecraft and has them fight their way through it and ultimately commandeer it. The aliens are specifically designed gray humanoids with large black eyes, operating advanced technology, having apparently been observing Earth for some time. From a pure narrative standpoint, the DLC is straightforward enough. But the questions it raises for the broader lore are harder to resolve. If extraterrestrial visitors have been present throughout the Fallout universe's history, what role have they played in human technological development? The advanced energy weapons that constitute some of the most powerful items in the games are similar enough to the alien weapons encountered in Mothership Zeta that the comparison is impossible to avoid. Did pre-war human energy weapons technology develop independently, or was there some form of alien technology transfer along the way? The Fallout community has never reached consensus on how seriously to take Mothership Zeta's implications, partly because the DLC itself is somewhat tonally inconsistent with the rest of Fallout 3's content, and partly because Bethesda has not followed up on its implications in any subsequent mainline game. The alien spacecraft appears in the sky above the capital wasteland, visible from the surface, after the DLC's events, a permanent and rather large implication that something extraordinary has happened, sitting above the game world without anyone in the game world acknowledging it. It is the Fallout universe's equivalent of a very large elephant in a very specific room. The question of what is happening in Appalachia in the years after Fallout 76 is another area where the lore has raised threads that the subsequent games do not necessarily address. Fallout 76 is set in 2102, 25 years after the Great War, much closer to the event than any other mainline game, and its narrative follows the residents of Vault 76 as they emerge into the wasteland and attempt to establish a functioning, post-war community. The game introduces a number of factions and story elements specific to Appalachia that do not appear in any subsequent game set in the same universe. The nature of that absence is interesting. Appalachia, by 2277, would have had roughly 175 years to develop from the state it was in at the end of Fallout 76's story. The choices made in Vault 76's reclamation effort would have had consequences. The Enclave forces in Appalachia, more fragmented and less coherent than the West Coast or East Coast versions, would either have been integrated into the region's evolving political landscape or destroyed. The community the Vault 76 residents were building would either have survived or failed. None of this is visible in the later games, which are set far enough from Appalachia that its specific history simply does not come up. Whether this silence is an oversight or a deliberate choice is unclear. It is possible that Bethesda considers the events of Fallout 76 too specific to the game's ongoing live service format to canonize definitively. Given that the game's story continues to develop with new content that may contradict or complicate earlier events, it is also possible that Appalachia simply exists in a part of the Fallout universe's geography that the main game series has not yet found a reason to revisit. The question of Fallout Tactics' canon status is similarly unresolved. Tactics, released in 2001, follows a Brotherhood of Steel force operating in the Midwest, specifically in the region stretching from Chicago through the Great Plains. The game introduced a version of the Brotherhood significantly different from the California chapter, more militarized and more willing to recruit outsiders, and explored factions and locations that do not appear in any other Fallout game. The Interplay-era Fallout Bible was ambiguous about Tactics' canon status, acknowledging the game but noting that the precise events it depicted were not necessarily compatible with the broader lore. Bethesda has been even vaguer on the subject. What Tactics demonstrates, regardless of its official canon standing, is how much material the Fallout universe contains that has never been fully explored. The Midwest of the Fallout universe, the Great Plains, the industrial cities of the old Rust Belt, the river systems and farming communities of America's agricultural heartland exists in the lore's geography, but has never been the setting of a major game. The same is true of the American Southeast, the Pacific Northwest, and most of New England outside the Commonwealth region around Boston. Canada, partially explored in Fallout 76's northern reaches, remains almost entirely unmapped. Mexico, referenced obliquely in various terminal entries, is essentially a blank. The Fallout universe is, after 25 years and 6 mainline games, still mostly terra incognita. The games that have been made explore a tiny fraction of the world that the lore implies exists. And the questions those games have raised about the Enclave's remaining cells, about the NCR's post-New Vegas political situation, about what the Brotherhood of Steel is going to do with the technological power it has accumulated, about what the Institute's destruction means for the Commonwealth in the years following Fallout 4, about what Vault-Tec's legacy looks like to the people inheriting it 200 years on or still waiting. The Fallout TV series, set in 2296 and confirmed as fully canon, is beginning to provide answers to some of these questions. The fate of Shady Sands, the state of the NCR, the continuing presence of the Enclave in various forms, the reach of the Brotherhood of Steel, the new California emerging from the wreckage of the old. Each answer opens new questions, as every good story should. The universe is still expanding. The questions are still accumulating. The terminal entries are still waiting to be read. The vaults are still sealed, most of them, their contents still unknown. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077, and in 2 hours ended everything that had been built over millennia. What is being built in the ruins, whether it is better or worse than what was there before, whether it learns anything at all from what it replaced, is the story that the Fallout universe is still telling. War never changes. But the people who fight it sometimes do. That is where we leave it for tonight. The wasteland has more corridors than any single journey can cover, and somewhere in the darkness there is always another terminal to read, another holotape to find, another mystery that has been waiting for 200 years for someone to notice it. If you made it this far, you were already the kind of person who looks closely at things. The Fallout universe was made for you. If this video helped you sleep a little better, or think a little harder, or just spend some time in a world that is big enough to get genuinely lost and leave a like, it means more than you probably think. And if you want to be around for whatever we explore next, subscribing is how that works. Until then, rest well. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up. Section 15. The Master and the Unity Fallout's first great villain. Before the Enclave. Before the Institute. Before Caesar built his legion from the bones of conquered tribes, there was the Master. And the Master had a dream that if you were willing to spend enough time with the original Fallout's terminal entries and the dialogue trees that lead to the most extraordinary conversation in the franchise's history, turns out to be genuinely, disturbingly coherent. Richard Moreau was his name, before he was anything else. He was born in Vault 8, the Control Vault, the one where the experiment was simply to see if a vault community could function and eventually build a city above ground. Vault 8 eventually became Vault City, one of the more advanced communities in the post-war West, and its residents included people who retained the intellectual tradition of the pre-war world. Richard Moreau was expelled from Vault City for murder. The details of this expulsion are not part of the core game, only referenced in the Fallout Bible, but they establish something important. Before he became the Master, Richard Moreau was already a man capable of significant violence. Operating outside the structures of his community, he made his way to the Mariposa military base. Not long after the Great War, before the Brotherhood of Steel or the Vault Dweller or any of the events that would structure the post-war West, he encountered the FEV there, the same forced evolutionary virus that the scientists had been using on prisoners, the same virus that Roger Maxson would discover decades later and find sufficient reason to execute an entire research team. But Moreau's encounter with the FEV was not as a scientist studying it. He fell into a vat of it, literally. He was submerged in the liquid FEV and survived, which is not something the human body is designed to do. What came out of the vat was not precisely Richard Moreau anymore. The FEV had done things to his body and his mind simultaneously. His physical form began to deteriorate and transform, but his cognitive functions, rather than breaking down as they did in most FEV subjects, expanded in ways that were genuinely extraordinary. He became, over the following years, something the Fallout universe does not have much precedent for, a biological intelligence of extraordinary capability, still mostly human in his consciousness and his memories, but operating with a kind of cognitive reach that no ordinary human brain had. He also began absorbing other people, physically, psychically. What the Master became, across the decades between his accident and the events of the first Fallout game, was a collective consciousness, a mass of fused biological material that incorporated the minds of individuals who came into contact with it. The entity called the Master had multiple voices, multiple perspectives, multiple fragments of consciousness, all integrated into a single presence. When you meet him in Fallout 1, he speaks in several voices simultaneously, finishing each other's sentences, representing different aspects of his composite self, and presenting an argument that is simultaneously seductive and horrifying. The argument is called the Unity, and the Master has been working toward it for decades by the time the Vault Dweller finds him. The Unity's premise is this: humanity, as it existed in the pre-war world, is finished. Radiation, time, and the accumulated chaos of the post-war world mean that baseline human genetics are slowly losing the genetic diversity and robustness required to sustain a viable civilization. The wasteland's population is degrading, not as dramatically as the worst environmental catastrophes would suggest, but measurably, consistently, over generations. Left alone, ordinary humans will eventually reach a population threshold below which recovery is impossible. Super mutants, by contrast, are immune to radiation, are enormously physically robust, do not suffer from the genetic diseases and immune deficiencies that accumulate in post-war human populations, and can survive conditions that would kill ordinary humans. The Master's plan was to use the FEV strategically, carefully, with the intention of preserving cognitive function rather than destroying it to convert as much of the wasteland's human population as possible. Those who survived the conversion with their intellect intact would form a new species, physically powerful, radiation-resistant, genetically stable, capable of rebuilding civilization on a foundation that could actually last. The Unity, in the Master's vision, was not about destroying humanity. It was about replacing it with something that could do what humanity had been unable to do: survive, stably, for long enough to actually rebuild. The problem, the devastating, foundational problem that the Vault Dweller can discover and present to the Master in one of the most remarkable conversations in any video game, is that the Master is wrong about the science. Super mutants are, in fact, sterile. The FEV conversion process destroys reproductive capacity. The Master's grand vision of a super mutant civilization capable of sustainable long-term survival is built on a biological impossibility. Super mutants cannot have children. The Unity is not a program for preservation. It is, if run to completion, a program for eventual extinction, producing a generation of exceptionally robust individuals who will then die without successors. When the Vault Dweller presents this to the Master with documentation, the game allows for a response that no other villain in the franchise has ever given. The Master believes you. He verifies the data. He understands what it means. And then, depending on how the conversation goes, and whether your character has sufficient intelligence and persuasion skills to carry the argument all the way through, he destroys himself. He collapses the cathedral, his base of operations, taking himself and his army with him. There is no moment in the Fallout franchise more interesting than this one. A man with genuine, if horrifically misguided, ambitions for the future of his species. Presented with proof that those ambitions are built on a scientific error, responds by ending himself rather than continuing a project he now understands to be meaningless. The Master is not stupid. He is not irrational. He is a being of remarkable intelligence who has been wrong about the most important thing. And when he understands that he has been wrong, he draws the only conclusion he can live with, or rather, cannot live with. It would be easy to read this as a simple validation of the player's cleverness, the satisfying moment of talking a villain out of his plans. But the Fallout universe's framing is more complicated than that. The Master had been working toward the Unity for decades. He had converted thousands of people, forced conversions, against consent, with a failure rate that produced the feral supermutants that populate the wasteland's most dangerous areas. He had built an army. He had a philosophy. He had, in his composite consciousness, the voices of every person he had absorbed, contributing to his understanding of the world. And the voice that emerged from all of that, when presented with undeniable truth, was the voice of a man who preferred death to meaningless continuation. The Master is the Fallout franchise's most honest statement of what ideology in service of a wrong premise looks like. Not malevolent for its own sake, not enjoying cruelty, working with genuine dedication toward a goal that turned out to be impossible. The Unity was built on a biological fact that the Master never checked. Decades of atrocity for a species-level project that was biologically incoherent from the beginning. That is not a story about evil. It is a story about the cost of certainty, about what happens when someone with extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary power mistakes the conviction of their belief for the truth of it. Every Fallout villain after the Master is, in some ways, in conversation with him. The Enclave's leadership was certain of their genetic superiority. Caesar was certain of his historical diagnosis. The Institute's scientists were certain that sentience was not what they had created. Certainty without adequate questioning is one of the deepest dangers the Fallout universe identifies, running from the first game to the last entry and every game in between. Section 16, MR. House the Gambler Who Bet Civilization. In the ruins of what used to be Las Vegas, Nevada, a man has been alive for over 200 years. He is not a ghoul. He is not a super mutant. He is not a robot, exactly, though he has been connected to machines for so long that the distinction has become complicated. He is Robert Edwin House, founder of Robco Industries, the company that manufactured most of the personal computers and robotic systems in the pre-war United States. He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary individuals in the post-war world. House knew the bombs were coming. Not in a vague, systemic way, not just the general knowledge that the Sino-American War was escalating towards something catastrophic, but with specific mathematical precision. His pre-war predictive algorithms, fed on every available data point about geopolitical developments, resource consumption trends, military movements, and economic signals, had calculated a 94.5% probability of global nuclear war by 2077. He had been working backward from that probability for years. What he built in preparation was the infrastructure of New Vegas's survival. He directed the development and deployment of a network of missile defense systems around the Las Vegas metropolitan area, capable of intercepting the warheads that would otherwise have reduced the Strip to the same glowing rubble that everything else in the Mojave became. He had himself connected to an enormous computational network called the Lucky 38's mainframe. his biological body sustained by life support, while his consciousness interfaced with systems capable of managing far more complexity than any single human brain could handle. He had negotiated with the three major casino families of pre-war Las Vegas for their cooperation in maintaining the Strip as a functioning entertainment and economic center after the apocalypse. He had stockpiled platinum poker chips as currency for the economy he intended to establish. He had calculated, with meticulous precision, that the platinum chip, a data storage device with the software needed to fully unlock the capabilities of the Securitron army he had stockpiled beneath the Mojave, would be delivered to him on the afternoon of October 23, 2077. He was wrong by a few hours. The delivery was disrupted by the bombs. House spent the next 2 centuries waiting for the chip, managing New Vegas with reduced capabilities, unable to complete the plan he had prepared for. The courier delivers the chip, and then has to decide what to do about the man who has been waiting for it. House is, depending on how you engage with him, either the most pragmatic or the most presumptuous character in Fallout, New Vegas. His argument for his own leadership of the Mojave is built not on ideology but on competence. He is smarter than anyone else in the room, he has more information, he has been managing the complex systems of New Vegas for 200 years without collapsing, and the alternatives, the NCR's democratic dysfunction and military overextension, Caesar's brutal slave empire, the chaos of an independent Mojave without coordinated leadership are all, he argues, worse than the autocracy he offers. He is not entirely wrong about the alternatives. The game is scrupulously honest about this. The NCR ending is not obviously superior to the House ending in all respects, particularly regarding efficiency and long-term stability. Caesar's Legion ending is brutal, but produces a kind of order. The Yes Man ending the option for a completely independent Vegas is the most optimistic but also the most uncertain, relying on the courier's personal judgment rather than any system of governance with real institutional continuity. What House refuses to engage with is the question of consent. The people of New Vegas, the citizens of the Mojave, the population that will live under whatever governance structure emerges from the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, they have not been consulted. They will not be consulted. House's calculation of what is best for the region is comprehensive, sophisticated, and based on more information than any of them have access to. It is also made entirely without their input, and House has no real mechanism for incorporating their feedback. He is not a democratic leader who happens to be autocratic by necessity. He is a man who genuinely believes that asking people what they want is a less efficient method of determining what they need than simply analyzing the data himself. This makes House the most intellectually honest authoritarian in the Fallout universe. He does not claim to represent the people. He does not invoke popular will or national identity or divine mandate. He says plainly, "I am better at this than you are, and the evidence supports this claim, and therefore I should be in charge." The game allows you to accept this argument, reject it, or work with him until you have the power to replace him with something else. His age is one of the stranger threads in his character. House has been managing New Vegas since before the bombs fell. He has memories of the pre-war world, actual memories. Not the half-remembered fragments that ghouls carry or the second-hand knowledge that everyone else in the wasteland has to work with. He knew Las Vegas when it was a functioning city, when the casinos were staffed by living people rather than his Securitrons, when the Strip's lights reflected off car windows rather than rubble. He watched the bombs fall from the Lucky 38's observation deck. He experienced the moment of ending in a way that almost no other character in the franchise can claim. What that has done to him is something New Vegas leaves deliberately unresolved. House is focused, rational, and productive in a way that suggests his psychological processing of the Great War has been functional. But there are moments in conversation with him where something else shows through, not grief exactly, not nostalgia exactly, but something in the register of those emotions, a quality in the way he discusses the pre-war world that is not quite the detached pragmatism he projects everywhere else. He loved Las Vegas. Not sentimentally, perhaps not in a way he would describe using that word, but he chose to save it when he could have directed those same resources to any number of other things. The city he built before the war, and the version of it he has been maintaining since, are the same project. Something in him wanted this particular place to survive. Whether that constitutes something like humanity, in a being who has been more machine than biological for 2 centuries, is the question that House himself probably prefers not to examine too directly. Section 17. Point Lookout, The Tribal Mystery, and America's Forgotten Places. Fallout 3's Point Lookout DLC drops the lone wanderer into the marshlands of coastal Maryland, in a location based on the real-world Point Lookout State Park. It is, in many ways, the most genuinely strange piece of content in Fallout 3, tonally different from the rest of the game, set in a landscape that feels more decayed and organic than the capital wasteland's urban ruins, populated by a faction that resists the usual Fallout categories. The tribals of Point Lookout are descendants of the coastal communities that survived the Great War in relative isolation. 2 centuries of inbreeding and radiation exposure have left them cognitively limited in ways that the other groups in the Fallout universe do not exhibit. They speak in fragmented, difficult-to-parse language. They navigate their swamp territory with the confidence of people who know every route and waterway, and they are organized around a figure of worship called Desmond Lockhart's, which is complicated because Desmond Lockhart is also a ghoul you can meet and work with during the DLC, a former British intelligence agent who has been operating in Point Lookout for his own purposes for a very long time. The relationship between the tribals, Desmond, and the botanical garden that serves as a cult center for Point Lookout's stranger inhabitants involves a drug called punga fruit, a pre-war survivalists' automated facility, and an ancient, weathered book that the tribals have incorporated into their religious practice. The book is a copy of a pre-war self-help and spiritual wellness guide. The tribals do not read it. They cannot read it. But it has been present in their community long enough that the physical object has become a totem, a sacred artifact around which their spirituality has organized. What the book actually says is irrelevant to what it has come to mean. This detail, the transformation of an ordinary consumer product into a holy relic simply through proximity and time and the human need for meaning, is one of the more quietly profound things in the Fallout universe. The children of Adam worship radiation because radiation destroyed the world, and they needed something to organize a survival theology around. The tribals of Point Lookout worship a self-help book because it was there when they needed an anchor. The specific content of either object of worship is less important than the function the act of worship serves. It makes the world legible, gives it shape, provides a framework within which suffering can mean something rather than simply being suffered. Point Lookout also contains an extended subplot involving the pre-war history of a family called the Blackhawls, whose ancestral home sits on the point. The Blackhall family, the investigation reveals, had connections to the Dunwich cult, the same organization that worshipped Ugg-Qualtoth in the building that bears its name in the capital wasteland. The Blackhall Manor contains artifacts and documents that connect Point Lookout's mysterious coastal atmosphere to the same thread of pre-war occultism that runs through the Dunwich building. This geographical spread of the Dunwich thread from the Dunwich building in the capital wasteland to the Blackhall estate in Point Lookout to the Dunwich borer's quarry in the Commonwealth suggests that whatever the Dunwich family and their associates were connected to was not a local phenomenon. It was a network, possibly a national one, of people who had discovered or been drawn into contact with something that predated American history. The specific nature of that something, whether Ugg-Qualtoth and whatever rests beneath the borer's quarry are the same entity, different aspects of the same entity, or completely different phenomena that the Dunwich family managed to connect, remains one of the genuinely open questions in Fallout lore. The Appalachian setting of Fallout 76 adds another layer to the game's folkloric dimension: the Mothman. The Appalachian region has a real-world mythology of the Mothman, the creature reported by dozens of witnesses in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 1960s before the collapse of the Silver Bridge. The Fallout 76 version of the Mothman is not precisely supernatural. It is a large, mutant winged creature, but the game's treatment of it, including a cult of believers in the cult of the Mothman, who organize their spiritual lives around its appearances, gives it some of the same ambiguous quality that defines the Dunwich thread. Is the Mothman in Fallout 76 an ordinary giant mutant that frightened people into organizing a religion around it? Or is it something that actually interacts with the people who believe in it in ways that exceed what an ordinary large animal would do? The game's handling of the Mothman's prophetic quality, the way its appearances seem to correlate with significant events, in the tradition of the real-world Mothman mythology, suggests a deliberate ambiguity. There is at least some evidence in the game that the Mothman's presence is not random, that it appears in places where important things are about to happen. Whether this means it possesses some form of precognitive awareness, or whether the people who have been watching for it are naturally inclined to interpret its ordinary movements through the lens of prophecy, the game does not decide. America's folklore is full of things like this: creatures and places and events that occupy the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary, that resist classification as either natural phenomenon or genuine anomaly. The Fallout universe, with its decade-long interest in the relationship between superstition, religion, and the genuinely strange things that post-war radiation and biology have produced, handles this folklore territory with more care than it is sometimes given credit for. Section 18. The Courier's Road, Ulysses, and the Weight of Choices. The Lonesome Road DLC for Fallout New Vegas is the franchise's most intimate meditation on the cost of choices made without understanding their consequences. It is also one of the most ambitious pieces of writing in any Fallout game, a long conversation between two people who represent different responses to the same kind of loss, conducted through dangerous ruins, while both of them are simultaneously trying to navigate a path that might end in mutual destruction. The Divide is what is left of a town called Hopeville, in the southwestern Mojave. Before the events of Fallout New Vegas, it was a settlement, one of the early NCR communities trying to establish themselves in the desert, with all the fragility and hope that implies. The courier passed through it, carrying a delivery. The package they were carrying contained an encrypted transmitter that, when activated by the automatic verification systems in the area, sent a signal to a weapons platform that still recognized the access codes. Missiles fell. Hopeville was destroyed. The people who had been building something there were killed or transformed into the terrible things the lone wanderer meets in the Divide. The courier did not know what they were carrying. They did not understand the consequences of their delivery. The choice that destroyed Hopeville was not a moral choice at all. It was a logistical one, made without knowledge of what it would do. Ulysses knows all of this. He was in Hopeville when the missiles fell. He survived, and unlike the courier, who carries no memory of the event, having been shot in the head in the opening cinematic of New Vegas before reaching any of this, Ulysses has been living with the consequences for years. He has been following the courier's career through the Mojave, watching the person who destroyed Hopeville without knowing it, and making a decision about what to do with that knowledge. He decided to bring the courier to the Divide and let them see what their choices made. Not to kill them, not exactly, but to confront them with the full weight of something they did not know they had done. This is a different kind of vengeance than any Fallout game had previously explored. It is not the vengeance of personal loss or ideological opposition. It is something closer to the demand for witness, the need for the person responsible for a catastrophe to stand in the ruins of it and understand what they are responsible for. What makes Ulysses so fascinating as a character is his ideology. He is deeply invested in the idea of symbols, national symbols, cultural symbols, the flags and emblems that define collective identity. He was a member of Caesar's Legion and left. He was connected to the NCR and left. He understands both institutions from the inside, and what he understands has led him to believe that neither of them is capable of building something that will last, because neither of them has the right relationship to its own history. The Legion is built on a mythology that erases the past entirely. The NCR is built on the American flag, a pre-war symbol whose meaning has been slowly hollowed out by the institution that carries it. Ulysses wants to reset the board. He wants to fire the missiles in the Divide not just at Hopeville but at both the NCR and the Legion, crippling both forces and let the wasteland start again from something more honest. His argument is not that the wasteland deserves to suffer. It is that the current trajectories of the two dominant factions lead to outcomes worse than the suffering of starting over. He has looked at the math and he does not like where it ends. The courier can talk him down. They can kill him. They can, in a remarkable option that requires high speech skill and genuine engagement with his argument, acknowledge his perspective while making the case that the choice he is about to make is the same kind of choice that made the Divide, made without full knowledge of its consequences, made from a position of certainty that no one actually has. The courier cannot prove that Ulysses is wrong about the trajectories of the NCR and the Legion. What they can do is ask him to accept, as he has asked them to accept, that not all consequences can be predicted. This conversation, conducted in ruins, Between two people who have both been shaped by catastrophe, neither of whom has clean hands, is the emotional and philosophical summit of the New Vegas DLC content. It is asking questions that none of the game's main endings fully answer. Can you build something good after this much has been destroyed? Does the acknowledgement of what was lost change what can be built? Is there a way forward that is not just the recycling of old failures in new costumes? Ulysses has his flag. It is not the NCR's flag or the Legion's standard. It is older an American flag from before the Great War, a symbol of something that existed before it was corrupted into the specific forms the wasteland inherited. He carries it not out of nostalgia for what was, but out of a belief that the symbol, properly reclaimed and properly understood, could mean something different, something true. It is the Fallout universe's most explicit engagement with the question of whether it is possible to inherit a tradition's aspirations while acknowledging and refusing its failures. The courier leaves the divide. Whatever choices they made, whatever the divide means in the larger story of the Mojave, they carry it with them. All of the game's protagonists carry things like this accumulated weight, the consequences of choices made in ignorance or necessity or full knowledge, the history of a world that ended and is now trying to figure out what comes next. The wasteland is not a clean slate. It never was. It is the Great War's aftermath, and the aftermath of the wars before that, and the consequences of every decision every character in this franchise has ever made, still resonating in the corridors of every ruin and the voices of every person still alive. Section 19. What the Wasteland teaches Fallout's enduring moral architecture. The Fallout series has, over 25 years, developed something that most long-running game franchises never quite achieve: a moral architecture. Not a moral code, not a simple set of rules about what is right and wrong, but an architecture, a framework that generates moral complexity rather than resolving it. That puts the player in positions where the right choice is genuinely unclear and the wrong choice has human faces. Every major faction in the Fallout universe is built on a legitimate concern. The Brotherhood of Steel is right that dangerous technology requires custodianship. The NCR is right that democratic governance and rule of law are worth fighting for. The Institute is right that the advancement of knowledge requires protection from the chaos of the surface. Caesar is right that the NCR's democratic dysfunction allows corruption and inefficiency to compound over time. The Enclave is right that the preservation of human civilization requires the survival of human knowledge and human competence. The Children of Adam are right that people need meaning, and that the communities which provide meaning tend to endure. Every major faction in the Fallout universe is also catastrophically wrong in specific ways that their legitimate concerns do not excuse. The Brotherhood's custodianship of technology has become hoarding, denying people resources that could save their lives. The NCR's democratic commitment has produced a corruption and military overextension that threatens to hollow out the institution. The Institute's protection of its research has become a tool of exploitation and terror. Caesar's critique of democracy has produced a slave empire built on the suppression of every human value that democracy imperfectly protects. The Enclave's concern for civilizational preservation has produced a genocidal program that would preserve the form of civilization by destroying most of the people living in its ruins. The Children of Adam's community of meaning requires that its members embrace an ideology that accelerates their physical deterioration. The Fallout universe does not present these contradictions as resolvable. The player does not achieve a state in which all of the legitimate concerns are honored and all of the catastrophic wrong turns are corrected. The best endings in every Fallout game are better than the alternatives, not perfect. They leave open questions, unresolved tensions, things that are going to be hard again in 10 years or 50 years or whenever the next crisis arrives. This is, to put it plainly, the most honest thing about the franchise. The world of the Wasteland is not broken because of one bad decision or one bad person or one catastrophic failure of judgment. It is broken because the people who built it could not sustain the balance between legitimate competing concerns that a functional civilization requires. They tipped too far, too consistently, in the direction of power at the expense of accountability, toward institutional self-interest at the expense of the people the institutions were built to serve. The games do not argue that this was inevitable. They argue that it happened, and they trace how it happened with enough specificity and enough empathy for the people who made the choices that led there, that you understand not forgive, but understand how the world got from the founding era to the 23rd of October, 2077. Nobody in the pre-war world thought they were making the choice to end civilization. They were each making a choice that seemed defensible from where they stood, and the cumulative weight of all those defensible choices was a nuclear exchange that lasted 2 hours and killed 7.5 billion people. The people walking the wasteland 200 years later are doing the same thing. They are each making choices that seem defensible from where they stand. The NCR soldier who follows orders to displace tribal communities is following the logic of a democratic government's resource needs. The Brotherhood paladin who confiscates medicine from a struggling settlement is following the logic of preventing dangerous technology from falling into the wrong hands. The Institute scientist who programs a synth to infiltrate a community and replace a key figure is following the logic of protecting research essential to the Institute's survival. The Legion soldier who burns a raider camp is following the logic of an order that produces security however brutally. The Fallout universe is asking you, game by game, to inhabit these logics, to understand them from the inside, to feel the genuine pull of them, to recognize the legitimate concern beneath the atrocity, and then to decide what you are going to do. Not what character class you are playing, not what alignment you are running. What you are going to do. Because the game takes seriously the idea that the person making the choice is you, not your character build, and that the choice carries the weight it would carry if it were real. This is what makes Fallout, at its best, something more than a game about exploring post-apocalyptic ruins with a gun. It is an extended meditation on how choices accumulate into consequences that exceed any individual's intention or control. It is a question about whether the people who inherit the worst of their predecessors' decisions have any obligation to address them, and whether they have any realistic capacity to do so, and what happens when the obligation and the capacity are not matched. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077. 200 years later, in the games, people are still living in the aftermath. Not because the aftermath is permanent, the world is changing, slowly, imperfectly, but because the decisions that produced the Great War were not accidents. They were built into institutions, normalized over decades, rationalized by the same voices that built the Enclave, and funded the Vault experiments, and pushed the FEV research past every ethical limit. Changing the wasteland means changing those patterns. It means building institutions that maintain accountability rather than eroding it. It means choosing, over and over, the harder and slower path over the more efficient and more ruthless one. War never changes, says the narrator. But the Fallout series has always been slightly less certain about this than that famous opening line suggests. Because the people who fight wars change. The people who end wars change. The people who decide what to build in the ruins of wars change. Every game in the franchise puts you at that crossroads, the moment when the war is over and the question of what comes next has not yet been answered, and asks you what you are going to do about it. Somewhere in a vault, the door is still sealed. Somewhere in a bunker, a terminal is still running, its screen glowing faintly with records from a world that ended before it could understand what it had become. Somewhere in the dark, the mysterious stranger is waiting for someone who needs him. The wasteland is patient. It has been waiting 200 years for someone to figure it out. Maybe it will be the next person who steps out of a vault, blinking in the daylight, and starts asking questions. War never changes, but stories do. This has been a long walk through the Fallout universe's deepest rooms. We started with a world that never quite was a version of America that branched off from our history sometime in the mid-20th century and drove itself, with the internal logic of its own anxieties, into catastrophe. We trace the Great War's contested origins through the fog of propaganda and corporate conspiracy and institutional failure. We spent time in the vaults, those carefully engineered chambers where human beings were used as data points for experiments that no one had the authority to refuse. We followed the Enclave from their oil rig to their bunkers to their increasingly fragmented attempts to remake a world they helped destroy. We watched the Brotherhood of Steel begin as an act of principled defiance and slowly calcify into something its founder might not have recognized. We stood in the boardroom where Caesar was made, and in the ruins of Hopeville where the courier's choices left their mark, and in the submerged chamber where something ancient waits beneath a quarry that never had any marble to find. These are the stories that the Fallout universe has been building for 25 years. They are not complete. They were never meant to be complete. Every answer opens into more questions. Every faction's legitimate concern generates its catastrophic wrong turn. Every player character carries something forward without knowing exactly what they are carrying or where it will land. That is the point. The wasteland is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be navigated by people who are carrying the weight of everything that came before them and trying to make something worth carrying it for. There is always another terminal to read. There is always another vault that has not been opened. The story of the Fallout universe is still being written. In new games and new series and new conversations in fan forums and late-night videos exactly like this one, where people who care about this world and what it is saying sit with the questions it raises and do not rush toward easy answers. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077. The world ended and kept going. People are still walking through the ruins, still finding notes from people who are long dead, still making choices in the echo of choices that were made before they were born. War never changes. But maybe, if you pay close enough attention to everything the wasteland has been trying to tell you, what comes after the war can. If you made it all the way here, thank you. Genuinely. If this helped you sleep, or helped you think, or just gave you 3 hours in a world that you find as endlessly interesting as I do, leave a like. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for whatever we explore next. And leave me a comment with where you're watching from. I love knowing where these videos find people. Rest well. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up. Bonus section: the smaller mysteries, holotapes, hidden rooms, and the human scale. For all the grand conspiracies and civilizational collapses that define the Fallout universe at the level of factions and history, some of the most memorable and affecting pieces of lore in the franchise exist at a completely different scale. They are not about the Enclave or the Brotherhood or the fate of democracy in the American Southwest. They are about individual people, people whose names the lore gives you briefly, or not at all, whose lives were part of the unremarkable fabric of the world that ended, and whose final moments, recorded in terminal entries and holotapes and handwritten notes, have survived 200 years in the ruins of their ordinary lives. Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland is full of these. There is an apartment building somewhere in the northwest quadrant of the map that contains, if you look carefully enough, the story of a family's last night. The refrigerator has food. The beds are made with the same precision that suggests someone was expecting to be back soon. A child's crayon drawings are still taped to the wall. The terminal in the living room has a final entry dated the 23rd of October 2077 that says simply, "The siren started about an hour ago. We are going to the shelter now. I love you all." It does not say whether they made it. The apartment says the same thing that every ruin in the Fallout universe says, that the people who lived in these places were living their lives, right up until they could not. There is a vault in the early game area of the Capital Wasteland, not a Vault-Tec experiment vault, just a reinforced basement where a man had been stockpiling supplies for years before the Great War, convinced by his own private calculations that something was coming. He got it right. He had enough food to last him for years. His holotapes chart the progression of his survivalism from preparation into isolation. From isolation into something that reads like genuine psychological collapse, as the months after the bombs stretched into years, and he began to understand that being right about the disaster was no consolation for being alone in its aftermath. The tapes end. The vault door is open. He left at some point. What he found outside or what found him, the game does not say. In Fallout, New Vegas, the Mojave Wasteland contains a camp far out in the desert, not a named location, barely large enough to find without knowing to look, where a pair of followers of the Apocalypse medics had set up an emergency treatment station for civilians caught in the crossfire of the NCR Legion conflict. Their medical journal runs for months. They describe injuries in clinical detail alongside notes about the people they belong to: a farmer who had been trying to harvest from a landmine-riddled field, a child whose family had been trying to cross the desert between factions, an old woman who had been living in her house for 60 years and refused to be moved even when the front line came to her door. The journal ends in the middle of a sentence. These stories exist alongside the grand narratives of the Courier's choices about Hoover Dam. They are not connected to those narratives in any mechanical way. They do not give you quests or caps or experience. They exist because the designers of the Fallout universe understood, instinctively and deeply, that an apocalyptic setting is only as meaningful as the ordinary lives it interrupts. The grand narrative of who controls the Mojave is important. The human cost of that narrative is what makes the importance mean something. The Fallout 4 Commonwealth is particularly dense with these micro-narratives. The game's settlement system means that players return again and again to the same locations, and each return reveals new details about what was there before. The houses that now serve as settlement foundations have pre-war histories legible in their architecture and their objects. The study with law books and framed diplomas, the kitchen where someone had been baking on the morning the bombs fell, the nursery where someone had been waiting for a child to arrive. The sole survivor, as a pre-war person, has a relationship with these spaces that no other player character in the franchise has had. They remember what these things meant. In a world where they worked and made sense, and the disjunction between memory and ruin is one of the game's quiet, persistent griefs. The Dunmore House, near one of the Commonwealth's forest settlements, contains a terminal history that traces a family's response to the resource wars over 15 years of entries. The early entries are anxious but functional, a couple managing their finances, worrying about gas prices, watching the news from Anchorage with the specific detachment of people whose anxiety is real, but whose immediate lives remain intact. The middle entries are tighter, the language more strained, as the war's economic effects reach their household. The later entries are short and careful, the way language becomes when there is too much to say and no good way to say any of it. The final entry is a grocery list. It is dated the 20th of October, 2077, 3 days before the bombs. They were planning a dinner. These details, the dinner being planned, the child's drawings taped to the wall, the journal that ends in the middle of a sentence, are what give the Fallout universe its emotional weight. The grand conspiracy about who dropped the first bomb matters because of the dinner that was never cooked. The horror of the Vault experiments matters because of the families who trusted Vault-Tec with their children's lives. The Enclave's genocidal program matters because of the people living on the surface who had spent 200 years building something worth not destroying. The wasteland is not an abstract political problem. It is the physical residue of 7,700 million lives, most of which ended in a 2-hour window on a Saturday in October, and the remainder of which have been lived in the shadow of that ending ever since. Every raider camp was once a community. Every irradiated crater was once a neighborhood. Every ghoul was once a person with a grocery list. The Fallout universe asks you to hold all of this simultaneously, the grand scale of the conspiracy and the small scale of the individual life, because both are true, and because understanding only one of them misses something essential. The institutions that built the bombs were made of individuals who had dinner plans and children and grocery lists. The people walking the wasteland, trying to build something in the ruins, are also individuals with dinner plans and children and grocery lists. The distance between the people who ended the world and the people trying to rebuild it is not as great as the difference in their circumstances might suggest. They are all, finally, just people, trying to make something that lasts in a world that has shown them it cannot last, and finding in that effort something that feels, against all probability, like hope. The holotapes run out, the terminal entries stop, the handwritten notes fade, but there is always another note, in another house, in another part of the wasteland, from another person who was there and felt something worth recording. The archive of human experience that the Fallout universe preserves in its ruins is, in the end, the most important thing about it. Not the nuclear politics or the faction ideologies or the questions about who fired the first missile, but the simple, persistent evidence that people lived here and felt things here and tried here right up until the moment they could not. That evidence does not dissolve. It waits in the ruins for someone to find it. It waits 200 years, patient as bedrock, for the right pair of eyes, maybe yours. There is a terminal somewhere in the Fallout universe that has not been found yet. It has been running on a backup power cell since 2077, and the battery is still good, and the screen is still lit, and the entry on it is from a person who is long dead and who never knew that anyone would read what they wrote. They wrote it anyway, just in case someone was listening. The wasteland always has been full of people like that. Final section. The couriers rode through the Mojave New Vegas as the franchise philosophical peak. Fallout. New Vegas occupies a specific and somewhat singular place in the franchise's history. It was developed in 18 months by a studio that had never previously released a Fallout game, working with an engine they had not built, with a budget and timeline that produced a game that launched with significant technical problems. And it is, by the consensus of the Fallout fandom, the franchise's artistic and philosophical high point, the game that does most fully what the Fallout universe is capable of doing. The reasons for this are worth spending time with because they illuminate what the franchise is actually about at its best. New Vegas's central question is not the one the game announces. The announced question is about who controls the Mojave Wasteland, the New California Republic, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House, or the player character operating independently. These are meaningful choices with genuine stakes and interesting implications, and the game presents them with more even-handedness than most games manage when dealing with politically loaded material. But the deeper question, the one the game keeps returning to through its best characters and its best dialogue and its best locations, is about what a person owes to history. Not to their own history, specifically, to the broader history that shaped the world they are walking through. The courier walks the Mojave Wasteland in 2281, 204 years after the bombs fell, and every inch of that wasteland is the result of decisions made by people who are now dead. The courier did not cause the Great War. They did not build the NCR or found Caesar's Legion, or design Hoover Dam, or create the conflict that the second battle will resolve. They inherited all of it, walked into the middle of it carrying a package for delivery, got shot in the head, and woke up in the middle of someone else's history. What the courier does with that inheritance is the game's question. And the four main endings represent four different philosophical positions on the question of inheritance and obligation, and what it means to be present in a moment of historical decision. The NCR ending is the argument for imperfect democracy, for the proposition that a corrupt, inefficient, overextended democratic institution is still worth fighting for and improving rather than replacing with something apparently more functional but built on suppression. The NCR at the end of New Vegas is not a good institution. It is a better institution than it was, slightly, if the courier chose to help it rather than undermine it. And that slight improvement, the ending slides suggest, is real. Change in democratic institutions is slow and incomplete, and easy to be cynical about. The NCR ending refuses the cynicism without pretending the improvement is larger than it is. The Caesar's Legion ending is the argument that strength, discipline, and hierarchical order produce stability that democracy cannot, and that the human cost of that stability is worth paying for the security it provides. The game is honest enough to show you both the genuine stability of Legion territory and the full horror of how that stability is maintained. It does not sanitize the Legion's methods to make the choice easier. If you choose the Legion, you are choosing the stability with the horror, not the stability without it. The ending slides show the Mojave more orderly and less free, in ways the game trusts you to evaluate. The Mr. House ending is the argument for technocratic competence, for the proposition that a sufficiently intelligent, sufficiently informed individual with a long enough time horizon can manage a society better than democratic processes can, and that the loss of individual agency in that society is worth the gain in coordinated efficiency. House's ending is one of the most genuinely ambiguous in the game. Las Vegas prospers, the technology advances, the Securitrons maintain order. Whether the people living under that order are better or worse off than they would be under the alternatives is a question the ending slides present rather than answer. The Yes Man ending independent New Vegas, the courier managing the Mojave without any of the major factions' guidance, is the most optimistic and the most uncertain. It asks whether one person, however capable, can substitute for the institutional structures that every other ending maintains. Whether good intentions and intelligent improvisation can replace the functions that organized government, even flawed organized government, performs. The ending slides are notably less confident than those of the other endings, because the game is honest about the fact that the independent Mojave's success depends entirely on what the courier does next, and what the courier does next is beyond the game's ability to show you. None of these endings is clearly right. Each contains a genuine argument. Each contains costs that the argument does not adequately address. This is not a failure of the game's moral framework. It is the game's moral framework. New Vegas was written by people principally Chris Avallone and Josh Sawyer, with significant contributions from many others who were thinking carefully about what post-apocalyptic fiction is actually for. Not for the escapism of a world without consequences, but for the particular kind of clarity that comes from looking at stripped down, catastrophic versions of ordinary civilizational questions and asking what you actually believe. The Mojave Wasteland is the American West reduced to its bones. The question of who controls the water and the electricity and the roads and the trade routes, without the elaborate institutional wrapping that the pre-war world placed around those questions, becomes both more legible and more honest. The NCR wants the Mojave's resources because democracies need to deliver material benefits to their populations. Caesar wants the Mojave because empires need to expand or they stagnate. House wants the Mojave because he has a plan for it and cannot execute the plan without controlling it. None of these motivations is obscure or difficult to understand. They are the ordinary motivations of ordinary power, made visible by the absence of the institutional clothing that, in more normal circumstances, makes them harder to see. The courier, walking into the middle of all of this, is not a historical accident. They are, in the game's deepest logic, the embodiment of the question that the franchise keeps asking. What does a single person owe to a world they did not make? The Courier did not create the NCR or the Legion or Mr. House's New Vegas. They did not fire the first missile or design the Vault experiments or build the power armor that the Brotherhood hoards. They are just here, now, in a moment that happens to be decisive, and the decision will be made by whoever has the will to make it. The Lonesome Road makes this explicit by revealing that the Courier has made decisive choices before choices they do not remember, that had consequences they did not anticipate. The road behind them is paved with results they did not intend and cannot undo. The road ahead is paved with choices they have not yet made, with consequences they cannot fully anticipate. This is not a condition specific to the Courier. It is the condition of every person, in every moment, trying to navigate a history that they neither made nor fully understand. War never changes. The causes that produce wars, the competition for resources, the clash of ideologies, the institutional dynamics that make conflict more likely than resolution are durable features of any civilization complex enough to generate them. The Fallout universe does not argue that human nature can be changed. It argues that the specific choices made by specific people in specific moments determine whether those features of human nature produce tolerable outcomes or catastrophic ones. The difference between the pre-war world and the wasteland is not that the pre-war world had better people. It is that the pre-war world's institutions stopped generating the feedback mechanisms that kept the worst possibilities from becoming the most likely ones. And when the feedback stopped, the system ran to its endpoint. What the wasteland offers paradoxically is a second chance. Not a clean slate, the ruins are full of the evidence that there is no such thing as a clean slate, that the past is always present in the consequences it has produced. But a moment of genuine choice, unmediated by the institutional inertia that makes change so difficult in functioning systems. The people who survive the wasteland, who build settlements and factions and communities in its ruins, are doing something that the pre-war world's complexity and established patterns made nearly impossible. They are deciding, from scratch, what they actually want from each other. Most of the time, what they want looks a lot like what the pre-war world provided: security, community, dignity, the ability to build something for their children. The specific arrangements they create to provide these things are varied and imperfect, and full of the compromises that any real community requires. Some of them fail. Some of them turn into the kind of institutions whose long-term trajectories the Courier is trying to influence. Some of them quietly persist, generation by generation, producing the slow accumulation of stability and trust that is the foundation of anything worth having. The vault door opens. The light outside is bright and strange. There is no map for what comes next, or rather, there is only the map you make, one choice at a time, carrying everything that came before you and trying to build something worth carrying it for. That is the story of the Fallout universe. That is the story of every person who has ever walked out of a shelter into the aftermath of something terrible and decided to try anyway. War never changes. But every morning, in the ruins and the settlements and the quiet places where the radiation barely reaches, people wake up and try to make something that does.